The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers, white roses, and polished smiles. Every guest believed they had gathered to celebrate the love story of Chicago's most admired billionaire heir and the woman who had captured his heart. Glasses were raised. Cameras waited. Soft music drifted through the crowd as reporters searched for the perfect photograph of the happy couple. Only one person in that room knew the celebration had already fallen apart. Brielle Marin stood in an ivory gown that suddenly felt heavier than stone. Her smile looked convincing enough to fool 200 guests, but her heart had been asking questions for weeks. Questions no one wanted answered. Questions every promise had failed to quiet. A gentle touch settled against the small of her back. Callum Rourke, the man she had trusted with every dream she had left. "The family wants a private toast before we go back inside," he said, his voice low and controlled. She studied his face for a moment. The warmth she had fallen in love with had become difficult to find. His eyes looked tired. His smile appeared practiced. Even standing inches away, he felt farther from her than he ever had before. Without arguing, Brielle followed him into the wide marble hallway outside the ballroom. The music faded behind the closed doors. The hallway was silent. Tall mirrors lined the walls. Fresh white flowers rested beneath polished columns. Every sound echoed across the empty space. Callum glanced toward the ballroom entrance before taking one slow step closer. His hand rested lightly against her waist, exactly the way a devoted fiancé should hold the woman he planned to marry. Anyone watching would have called it romantic. Brielle knew better. Hidden inside her evening clutch, a tiny recorder had already been running for several minutes. She had switched it on before leaving her apartment, not because she wanted proof, because she desperately hoped she would never need it. She lifted her eyes to meet his. "Tell me the truth," she whispered. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Callum looked past her shoulder, as though making certain nobody had followed them into the hallway. When his eyes returned to hers, they carried none of the tenderness that had once made Brielle believe she had found a forever kind of love. "You've been asking questions," he said quietly. "I deserve answers. You deserve peace." "No," she replied. "I deserve honesty." His jaw tightened. For one brief second, Brielle almost reached for his hand, almost reminded herself of the man who had carried paint supplies through the streets without caring about stained sleeves. The man who knew every child's name at the community center. The man who had knelt inside her classroom and promised to build a life, not simply a marriage. She waited for that man to return. He never did. Callum leaned closer until his lips were only inches from her ear. His next words came out so softly that anyone passing nearby would have mistaken them for something affectionate.
"I only keep you around for the inheritance."
"I only keep you around for the inheritance." Time stopped. Not because the hallway became silent, not because her heart stopped beating, because every doubt she had buried suddenly stood in front of her, demanding to be believed. He continued speaking in the same calm voice. "You were never supposed to be anything more. My grandfather needed a believable love story. You made everything easier." Each sentence landed with painful precision. Brielle didn't interrupt. She didn't gasp. She didn't ask why. Months earlier, she would have fought to save the relationship. She would have searched his face for another explanation. Today was different. She already had the answer she came looking for. The recorder inside her clutch captured every word without missing a single breath. As Callum finished speaking, Brielle's eyes shifted beyond his shoulder. In one of the tall mirrors at the end of the hallway, she noticed another reflection. Oren, half hidden near the ballroom entrance, watching, waiting, not for the engagement celebration, for this conversation to end. Brielle looked at Callum for one long moment. She wanted to ask how someone could speak so casually after promising forever. She wanted to ask whether every smile, every handwritten note, every gentle kiss had been nothing more than another step toward an inheritance. Instead, she gave him something he never expected, a quiet smile. "Thank you," she said. Confusion crossed his face. "Brielle." She raised one hand, stopping him before he could continue. "You've already said enough." Without another word, she walked past him toward the ballroom doors, leaving him standing alone in the hallway. He watched her go, unaware that every sentence he had whispered now lived inside a small recorder hidden in her evening clutch. The truth had finally found its voice. How did an ordinary art teacher end up standing in one of Chicago's most luxurious hotels, walking away from a billionaire she once believed was the love of her life? How did a woman who believed kindness mattered more than wealth become trapped inside a family where money carried more weight than honesty? The answers began long before the engagement gala, long before the designer gowns, long before the cameras, long before the whispered confession. They began 18 months earlier, back when Brielle Marin arrived in Chicago carrying only 2 suitcases, a teaching certificate, and memories of the parents who had taught her that love without respect never lasts. She wasn't searching for wealth. She wasn't hoping to marry into one of America's most influential families. She simply wanted a fresh start after losing everything that had once made life feel certain. She believed her future would be filled with classrooms, paintbrushes, children's laughter, and quiet evenings in a small apartment she could finally call home. She had no way of knowing that one unexpected meeting at a neighborhood community center would introduce her to Callum Rourke, the billionaire heir whose name appeared in newspapers, the man who would teach her the difference between falling in love and choosing herself. Before we go back to the beginning, I want to ask you for one small favor. If you enjoy emotional love stories filled with betrayal, redemption, second chances, and meaningful life lessons, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep bringing you stories that remind us why self-respect matters, why honesty is worth protecting, and why love should never cost you your dignity. While you're here, tell me in the comments, if the person you plan to marry looked you in the eyes and admitted they had only stayed with you because of money, what would you do? Would you walk away without saying another word? Would you demand an explanation? Or would you give them one final chance to tell the truth? I'd love to hear your thoughts, because every person sees betrayal differently. Now settle in, because this story isn't simply about a billionaire family, an inheritance, or a broken engagement. It's about the quiet warning signs people ignore, because love makes hope feel stronger than reason. It's about discovering that the hardest person to trust again isn't someone else. It's yourself. Let's go back to where everything truly began. A few minutes from now, Brielle will stand before hundreds of guests, remove the engagement ring every magazine wanted to photograph, and say something no one inside that ballroom is prepared to hear. By the end of the night, one of Chicago's most respected families will begin losing the image they spent generations protecting. A billionaire heir will watch the future he believed was guaranteed begin slipping through his hands. An aging grandfather will be forced to face the painful truth about the people he trusted most. And one ordinary school teacher will remind everyone in that room that dignity has a value no inheritance can ever match. The road to that moment wasn't built in a single day. It was shaped by small choices, promises that slowly changed, conversations left unfinished, warnings dismissed because love kept asking for one more chance. Every smile hid a question. Every celebration covered another crack. Every sacrifice pushed Brielle closer to a choice she never imagined she would have to make. She believed she was planning a wedding. She never realized she was preparing for the greatest test of her life. The remarkable part of this story isn't that someone betrayed her. Stories like that happen every day. The remarkable part is what Brielle chose to do after hearing the truth. She refused to beg. She refused to argue. She refused to compete for a place in someone's heart. Instead, she chose herself. That single decision would inspire children she taught, challenge powerful people who believed money solved every problem, and prove that real strength rarely arrives with raised voices or dramatic revenge. Sometimes, strength looks like walking away with your head held high. Sometimes the strongest answer is silence followed by action. So let's go back to where this unforgettable journey truly began. Back to the day Brielle Marin arrived in Chicago with 2 suitcases, a heart still healing, and no idea that meeting one man would change the course of her life forever. Long before Brielle Marin ever walked into a room filled with billionaires, She lived in a modest white house on a quiet street in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't the kind of place people traveled to visit. Most families had known one another for generations. News spread quickly, and people noticed everything. They remembered birthdays, celebrated graduations together, and whispered about every mistake before sunset. Brielle never cared much about gossip. She cared about home. Every weekday after school, she hurried to her mother's flower shop near the old courthouse. The little store smelled of fresh roses, lavender, and eucalyptus. Her mother, Diane, believed flowers carried messages that words often failed to express. When someone is hurting, she often told Brielle while trimming rose stems, people don't always need advice. Sometimes they simply need to know someone cared enough to show up. Brielle watched her mother comfort widows, congratulate newlyweds, and quietly prepare arrangements for families saying goodbye to loved ones. Diane treated every customer with equal warmth, whether they spent $10 or $500. Across town, Brielle's father, Martin, spent his days repairing antique clocks in a small workshop behind the flower shop. Tiny gears, polished brass, and delicate springs covered every shelf. Customers traveled from neighboring counties because everyone trusted Martin's careful hands. While other fathers taught baseball or fishing, Martin taught something different. He taught patience. One afternoon, when Brielle was barely 12, she asked why he refused to rush even the smallest repair. Martin smiled without looking up from the grandfather clock resting on his workbench. "Every clock tells the truth," he said. "It never pretends to have more time than it does." She frowned, trying to understand. He gently closed the clock's wooden case before kneeling beside her. "The people worth keeping in your life respect your time, Brielle. They don't waste it. They don't make promises they never intend to keep. If someone repeatedly asks you to wait while giving very little in return, they're telling you exactly where you stand." At 12 years old, the lesson sounded simple. Years later, those words would become the difference between losing herself and finding the strength to walk away. For many years, Brielle believed life would always feel the way it did inside that little house. Saturday mornings meant pancakes shaped like flowers because her mother insisted breakfast should make people smile before the day even began. Sunday afternoons belonged to long walks through the neighborhood, where her father greeted nearly everyone by name. Friday evenings often ended with all three of them sitting on the porch, sharing homemade lemonade while the sun slowly disappeared beyond rows of maple trees. Money was never abundant. Love always was. Looking back, Brielle would later realize those ordinary moments became the richest memories she ever owned. Everything changed during her sophomore year of college. Her mother was diagnosed with an aggressive illness that gave the family very little time to prepare. Diane never allowed fear to become the center of their conversations. Even while growing weaker, she insisted on opening the flower shop whenever she felt strong enough. One evening, after closing early, she handed Brielle a small notebook filled with pressed flowers between its pages. "I've written the meaning of every flower I've ever loved," Diane said softly. "Not because I expect you to become a florist." Brielle smiled through damp eyes. "Then why?" "Because someday you'll meet people carrying pain they don't know how to describe. Learn to notice the quiet things. The strongest hearts rarely make the loudest noise." Those became some of the last words Brielle ever heard from her mother. After the funeral, the flower shop felt strangely empty. Fresh bouquets still arrived every morning. Customers still opened the front door. The little bell above the entrance still rang. The only thing missing was the woman who had filled every corner of that place with warmth. Martin buried his grief beneath work. He repaired clocks from sunrise until late evening, hoping busy hands would quiet an aching heart. For a while, Brielle believed time would slowly help them heal. Instead, life dealt another painful blow. Less than 3 years later, Martin suffered a sudden heart attack while working alone inside the repair shop. By the time help arrived, there was nothing anyone could do. The man who had spent decades fixing broken clocks had quietly run out of time himself. Standing beside his grave, Brielle felt something inside her become frighteningly still. She was barely 25. Both parents were gone. The flower shop had been sold. The workshop sat empty. The home filled with laughter now echoed with silence. Friends urged her to stay close to familiar places. Instead, Brielle made the hardest decision of her life. She packed 2 suitcases, folded her parents' notebook into the top drawer of her luggage, accepted a teaching position in Chicago, and promised herself one thing. If she could no longer receive the kindness her parents had given so freely, she would spend the rest of her life giving it to someone else. Chicago welcomed Brielle with loud trains, crowded sidewalks, and a pace that felt nothing like the quiet streets she had left behind in Ohio. Her apartment was small. The kitchen barely had enough room for 2 people to stand comfortably. The bedroom overlooked an alley, where delivery trucks arrived before sunrise every morning. The heating system complained through most of winter, and the elevator seemed to choose its own schedule. Still, when Brielle placed a framed photograph of her parents on the bookshelf beside her bed, the apartment stopped feeling temporary. It became home. A week later, she reported to Lincoln Grove Middle School for her first day as an art teacher. The building showed its age. Hallway paint had faded over the years. Lockers carried dents from generations of students. Several classroom windows had tiny cracks in the corners. Budget cuts had left teachers finding creative ways to stretch every supply they had. None of that discouraged Brielle. When she unlocked her classroom for the first time, she saw possibility instead of problems. She spent the entire weekend transforming the room. She painted colorful quotes across bulletin boards. She arranged donated brushes by size inside old glass jars. She turned worn wooden shelves into miniature art galleries where every student's work would eventually hang. Above the whiteboard, she carefully placed a handwritten sentence her father used to repeat whenever life felt uncertain. "Your worth is never decided by the loudest voice in the room." On Monday morning, 28 students slowly walked inside. Some smiled politely, some avoided eye contact. Some carried burdens far heavier than backpacks. During attendance, Brielle noticed a quiet boy named Mateo, sitting alone near the back. His hoodie sleeves covered most of his hands. He never looked up. When the class began sketching self-portraits, every student started drawing except Mateo. His paper remained completely blank. Instead of calling attention to him, Brielle quietly walked over and sat beside him. "You don't have to draw yourself," she said gently. He shrugged. "I don't know what to draw." She smiled. "Then draw the place where you feel safest." Several minutes passed before his pencil finally moved. At the end of class, Mateo left a simple drawing on her desk. It showed a tiny apartment kitchen, where an older woman smiled while making soup. No words, no explanation, just love captured on paper. Brielle carefully tucked the drawing into her desk drawer. She understood something many people overlooked. Children often spoke more honestly through art than conversation. From that day forward, her classroom became much more than a place where students learned colors, perspective, and painting techniques. It became the one room in the building where children felt heard without having to explain every scar they carried. Every afternoon, Brielle stayed long after the final bell, helping students who simply needed someone willing to listen. She wasn't trying to become the favorite teacher. She simply remembered what kindness looked like. Because 2 ordinary people had spent their entire lives showing her how powerful it could be. Teaching filled Brielle's weekdays, but Thursdays belonged to a different purpose. Every Thursday afternoon, after the last student left Lincoln Grove Middle School, she packed a canvas tote with leftover paints, sketchbooks, brushes, colored pencils, and anything else she thought another child might enjoy. Instead of driving home, she headed across the city to the Harper Community Center. The building had once been an abandoned recreation hall before neighborhood volunteers transformed it into a place where children and teenagers could safely spend their evenings. The walls weren't perfect. The floors carried years of scratches. Some classrooms still used folding tables that wobbled whenever someone leaned against them. Yet every room overflowed with something money could never buy: hope. The center welcomed children whose families couldn't afford private lessons, after-school programs, or expensive hobbies. Some came because their parents worked late shifts. Others came because home wasn't always peaceful. No one asked uncomfortable questions. Everyone was simply welcomed. Brielle volunteered in the art room. She believed creativity gave children permission to express feelings they struggled to say aloud. Some painted dreams, some painted fear, some painted homes they wished they had. Every drawing mattered. One Thursday, a little girl named Lily carefully raised her hand. "Miss Marin?" "Yes." "Do you keep all our paintings?" Brielle smiled. "I wish I had enough walls." The little girl looked disappointed. "My dad says nobody keeps things kids make." Without saying another word, Brielle walked to a storage cabinet and pulled out dozens of carefully labeled folders. Each carried a student's name. She opened several. Inside were paintings, sketches, poems, and handwritten notes created over the past year. "I keep every single one," Brielle said. Lily's eyes widened. "You do?" "I do. But why?" "Because one day you'll be older, and you'll want proof that your voice mattered long before the world started listening." The little girl hugged her without warning. Moments like that reminded Brielle why she never regretted staying late every Thursday. She wasn't changing the entire city. She was changing one child's afternoon at a time. As the evening continued, the center's director, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, stepped into the art room carrying a clipboard. "There you are," she said with a relieved smile. "I've been looking for you." Brielle set down her paintbrush. "Everything okay?" "I hope so." Mrs. Brooks glanced around the room before lowering her voice. "Our annual fundraising committee is meeting tonight." Brielle nodded. "I remember. We're expecting several new donors this year." "I'm not much help with fundraising." Mrs. Brooks laughed softly. "I didn't ask you to raise money." "What do you need?" "I need someone who remembers why this place exists." Those words stayed with Brielle as she helped clean the room. She had no interest in wealthy sponsors. She wasn't impressed by expensive suits or impressive family names. As far as she was concerned, generosity wasn't measured by the size of a donation. It was measured by whether someone stayed after the applause ended. In less than an hour, a new face would walk through those front doors. A man whose last name appeared on hospitals, hotels, and charity buildings across the Midwest. A man everyone else expected Brielle to admire because of his fortune. She had absolutely no intention of treating him any differently than anyone else. The fundraising committee gathered inside a modest conference room beside the gymnasium. The furniture didn't match. Several chairs had been repaired more than once, and the coffee was served in paper cups because the center saved every dollar it could. Mrs. Brooks welcomed everyone before reviewing the year's goals. "We need new computers for the tutoring program," she began. "The art room needs easels. The music department has children sharing instruments. The roof over the east hallway also needs repairs before winter." Several business owners nodded politely. One promised to look into it. Another suggested starting an online fundraiser. Someone else recommended postponing the renovations until next year. Brielle remained quiet. She had attended enough meetings to know the difference between concern and commitment. The conference room door opened a few minutes late. Every conversation paused. A tall man stepped inside wearing a navy suit that fit perfectly without appearing flashy. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his expression carried none of the confidence people often expected from someone born into extraordinary wealth. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said. "Traffic coming from the foundation office was worse than expected." Mrs. Brooks smiled warmly. "Everyone, this is Callum Rourke." A few people immediately straightened in their chairs. Others exchanged impressed looks. The Rourke name carried influence throughout Chicago. Luxury hotels, private medical centers, scholarship programs, retirement communities. Nearly everyone recognized the family. Brielle simply offered a polite nod before returning her attention to the meeting notes in front of her. Throughout the discussion, she noticed something unexpected. Callum spoke very little. Instead of dominating the conversation, he listened. When Mrs. Brooks explained that students often shared paintbrushes because there weren't enough supplies, he quietly wrote something inside a small leather notebook. When another volunteer described the tutoring program's shortage of laptops, he asked thoughtful questions instead of making promises. He never interrupted. He never tried to become the center of attention. By the time the meeting ended, most guests hurried toward Callum, hoping to introduce themselves. Brielle headed in the opposite direction. She still had an art room to clean. Inside, she stacked paint trays, washed brushes, and lifted a large plastic storage bin filled with cloudy paint water and worn supplies. The cracked container was heavier than she expected. Before she managed a second step, another pair of hands reached for the opposite side. "I've got it." She looked up. "Callum." He smiled politely. "Where does this need to go?" Brielle studied his expensive suit for a brief moment before answering. "That depends." He raised an eyebrow. "On what?" She shifted her grip without letting go. "Whether you're offering because someone might be watching." Her eyes met his. "Or because you're willing to carry it all the way to the storage room." For the first time that evening, Callum laughed. Not the practice laugh of someone attending another charity event, a genuine one. He tightened his grip on the cracked plastic bin. "Show me where we're going." Without realizing it, neither of them had just started carrying old paint supplies. They had taken the very first step toward a story that would change both of their lives forever. The storage room sat at the far end of the community center, tucked behind the music classroom and a narrow hallway lined with children's artwork. The cracked plastic bin felt awkward to carry, especially with paint water sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Callum never complained. Halfway down the hallway, the handle dug into his hand, yet he simply adjusted his grip and kept walking beside Brielle. "You know," she said without looking at him, "that suit costs more than everything inside this bin." He smiled. "Probably. You don't seem concerned." "It's fabric." She looked at him. "Most people wearing something that expensive would panic if paint splashed on it. My grandmother used to say clothes are meant to serve people. And what if they get ruined? Then they did their job." His answer caught her off guard. Inside the storage room, shelves overflowed with donated supplies. Some boxes contained broken crayons sorted by color. Others held construction paper rescued from local schools. Nothing matched, yet everything had a purpose. Callum carefully placed the heavy container onto the floor before rolling up the sleeves of his tailored shirt. "What else needs to be done?" Brielle blinked. "Excuse me? You heard me." She laughed softly. "The meeting ended." "I noticed. So why are you still here?" He glanced around the crowded room. "Because the work clearly didn't end when the meeting did." Without waiting for instructions, he picked up a stack of folded easels leaning against the wall. "These? Second shelf." He carried them over. "What next?" For nearly 40 minutes, they worked side by side. They organized brushes, stacked canvases, moved storage boxes, swept dried paint chips from the floor. Not once did Callum check his watch. Not once did his phone become more important than the task in front of him. When everything was finally finished, Brielle leaned against the doorway and folded her arms. "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "I assumed you came here to make a donation." He smiled. "I did." She looked around the freshly organized room. "I don't see a check." "You don't." She frowned. "What did you donate?" Callum glanced toward the children laughing somewhere down the hallway. "My evening." For reasons she couldn't explain. That answer stayed with Brielle long after he walked out of the building. The following Thursday, Brielle expected Callum to disappear like so many generous donors before him. People often arrived with enthusiasm. They smiled for photographs. They promised support. They spoke about changing lives. A few weeks later, another meeting replaced the last one, and the children rarely saw them again. She assumed Callum would follow the same pattern. He didn't. Just before 5 o'clock, as students began filling the community center, Brielle heard a familiar voice near the front desk. "Where do you need me today?" Mrs. Brooks looked pleasantly surprised. "You came back." "I said I would." She handed him a volunteer badge. The art room could use another pair of hands. A few minutes later, Callum stepped through the doorway carrying several unopened boxes. "I stopped by an office supply store," he said. "I wasn't sure what the children needed most, so I asked one of the employees to help me." Brielle opened the first box. Sketchbooks. The second, colored pencils. The third, brushes, watercolor sets, erasers, sharpeners, and enough drawing paper to last for months. She looked at him. "You bought all this?" He shrugged. "The center gave me a list." "You didn't have to." "I know." There was no speech, no announcement, no request for recognition. Mrs. Brooks quietly stored the receipt in her office, because Callum insisted the donation remain anonymous. Word spread through the building anyway. Children have a remarkable way of noticing kindness. By the following week, several students greeted him before he even reached the art room. "Mr. Callum, you're back! Come see my drawing." Instead of standing beside Brielle, he walked straight toward the children. He knelt beside every table, asked questions, remembered names, celebrated even the smallest improvements. When Mateo proudly showed him a charcoal sketch of the Chicago skyline, Callum studied it as though it belonged inside a museum. "This is incredible." Mateo lowered his eyes. "It's not finished." Callum smiled. "Neither am I." The boy looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I'm still learning every day." "But you're a grown-up." "That doesn't mean I know everything." Several students laughed. The room instantly felt lighter. Later that evening, Lily accidentally spilled an entire cup of blue paint across the table. She froze. "I'm sorry." Before Brielle reached for paper towels, Callum had already grabbed a stack of cleaning cloths. "No problem. I ruined everything." He smiled while wiping the paint away. "No." He pointed toward the bright blue streak spreading across the tabletop. "You made a bigger mess than we planned." The children burst into laughter. Within seconds, everyone helped clean the table together. No one blamed Lily. No one made her feel embarrassed. As Brielle watched from across the room, she noticed something she hadn't expected. Callum wasn't trying to impress her. He had completely forgotten she was watching. He was focused on the children. Children, she knew from years of teaching, noticed things adults often missed. They recognized patience. They recognized sincerity. Most importantly, they recognized people who truly wanted to be there. By the end of the evening, nearly every student waved goodbye to Callum as though he had been volunteering there for years. Walking toward the parking lot, Brielle caught herself smiling. She quickly looked away. She still didn't trust wealthy men. But for the first time in a very long while, she wondered if she had been wrong about one of them. Weeks quietly turned into months. Without anyone announcing it, Callum became part of the Thursday routine. Children expected him. Mrs. Brooks counted on him. Even the volunteers began leaving certain projects unfinished because they knew he would arrive ready to help. What surprised Brielle most wasn't his consistency. It was his willingness to do the work nobody noticed. One Thursday, she arrived early and found him kneeling in the hallway with a screwdriver, repairing the loose leg of a folding table. She stopped walking. "I thought maintenance handled things like that." Callum looked up with a sheepish smile. "They're short-staffed." "So you volunteered?" "They showed me where they keep the toolbox." "You know how to fix tables?" "My grandfather insisted every member of the family learn basic repairs before learning how to run a company." She laughed. "I didn't expect that answer. There are a lot of things people don't expect." He tightened the final screw before testing the table. "No wobble." "Congratulations. I'll add professional furniture repairman to my resume." She shook her head, smiling despite herself. Over time, their conversations became longer. Some happened while organizing art supplies. Others during cleanup after the children went home. They talked about books, favorite childhood memories, music, travel, the best pizza in Chicago, the worst coffee either of them had ever tasted. Brielle noticed something unusual. Whenever she asked Callum about expensive vacations, luxury cars, or exclusive parties, he answered briefly before steering the conversation somewhere else. He seemed far more interested in hearing stories about her students than talking about his own wealth. One evening, she finally asked him why. "You could spend your Thursdays anywhere." "I could. You could be attending business dinners." "I attend enough of those." "You could hire people to volunteer in your place." He leaned against a nearby table, thinking carefully before answering. "My grandfather once told me something I'll never forget." "What was it?" "He said money can solve problems." She nodded. That's true. But it can't replace presents. Brielle remained quiet. He continued. When I was 10, I donated toys to a children's hospital. That sounds generous. I never met the children, so someone else delivered everything? He nodded. My grandfather looked at me afterward and asked one question. What? Oh, did you give them your toys, or did you give them yourself? She understood immediately. The answer wasn't the toys. No, it was your time. He smiled. That lesson stayed with me. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable, not awkward, not forced, simply peaceful. As they finished locking the supply cabinets, Brielle caught herself studying him, not the expensive watch on his wrist, not the tailored jacket hanging nearby. The man. She realized she still knew very little about Callum Rourke. She knew his kindness, his patience, his quiet sense of humor, but she knew almost nothing about the life waiting for him once he drove away from the community center. For reasons she couldn't explain, she wanted to know more. And for the first time since arriving in Chicago, Brielle found herself looking forward to next Thursday just as much as the children did. By the time December arrived, the Harper Community Center looked completely different. Paper snowflakes decorated the hallways. Children's paintings covered nearly every bulletin board. A tall Christmas tree stood near the entrance, decorated with handmade ornaments instead of expensive decorations. Every child had created one during art class, and no two looked alike. Mrs. Brooks smiled every time she walked past it. This, she often said, is the richest tree in Chicago. The center's annual Winter Hope fundraiser had become its biggest event of the year. Unlike glamorous charity galas held downtown, this gathering focused on the children rather than wealthy guests. Parents baked homemade desserts. Teenagers performed music they had practiced for months. The younger children proudly displayed paintings, sculptures, and handmade holiday cards. There wasn't a single crystal chandelier, no luxury centerpiece, no celebrity photographers, yet laughter filled every corner of the building. Brielle spent the evening helping students prepare for the art exhibition. She adjusted paintings, straightened display cards, encouraged nervous children before their families arrived. When Mateo's grandmother stopped in front of his charcoal skyline drawing, tears immediately filled her eyes. You made this? Mateo nodded shyly. I wanted you to have something beautiful. The older woman wrapped him in the tightest embrace Brielle had seen all year. Moments like that reminded her why art mattered. Not because it created masterpieces, because it gave people another way to say, I love you. Across the room, Callum was doing something entirely different. Instead of standing beside the largest donors, he sat cross-legged on the floor, helping 3 little boys assemble a cardboard city for their holiday display. One of them accidentally glued 2 buildings together upside down. The children froze. Callum looked at the crooked project before smiling. I think we just invented the first city where gravity takes weekends off. The boys burst into laughter. Within minutes, they were happily turning the mistake into part of the design. Mrs. Brooks quietly walked over to Brielle. You've been watching him. I've been watching the children. Mrs. Brooks smiled knowingly. Haven't we all? Haven't we all? As the fundraiser came to an end, families slowly made their way home carrying artwork, cookies, and happy children bundled inside oversized winter coats. Snow had started falling outside. Soft flakes drifted beneath the streetlights, covering parked cars and quiet sidewalks with a fresh blanket of white. Brielle stepped onto the center's small front balcony, grateful for a moment of silence after the busy evening. She wrapped her arms around herself as the cold air touched her face. A few seconds later, the door behind her opened. Without saying anything, Callum walked outside carrying 2 steaming paper cups. I guessed hot chocolate. She accepted one with a grateful smile. You guessed correctly. For several moments, they simply stood beside each other watching the snow fall over the city. Neither of them seemed in a hurry to break the peaceful silence. Neither realized this quiet winter evening was about to become one of the most important conversations either of them would ever have. The snow continued falling, quietly covering the sidewalks outside the community center. The city traffic sounded farther away than usual, leaving only the soft crunch of tires passing through fresh snow and the distant laughter of a few children still waiting for their parents. Brielle wrapped both hands around the warm paper cup. "This is my favorite part of every fundraiser," she admitted. Callum glanced at her. "The cleanup?" She laughed. "No. The hot chocolate?" She smiled again. "Close." He waited. "When everyone leaves." He looked confused. "Why?" "Because that's when I know whether people came for the children or for the event." He leaned against the balcony railing. "And what did you decide tonight?" She looked through the large front windows where volunteers folded tables and stacked chairs together. "I decided the children won. They usually do. They deserve to." A comfortable silence settled between them. Callum took a slow sip of his drink before speaking again. "You know." "What?" "I've attended charity galas worth millions." She raised an eyebrow. "I can believe that. Luxury hotels, 5-course dinners, auction items most people never need. And I've never left one of those evenings feeling the way I feel tonight." She studied him. "How do you feel?" He searched for the right words. "Useful." Her expression softened. "You don't feel useful at work?" "I solve business problems." "That's important." "It is. But those problems usually belong to companies." He nodded toward the art room behind them. "Tonight, I watched a little boy smile because someone believed his drawing deserved to be framed." He smiled to himself. "I've negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions. But that smile meant more." Brielle looked down into her cup, quietly absorbing his answer. "So why stay?" she asked. "You have every opportunity in the world." "I do. You could spend every evening somewhere far more glamorous than this." "I could, yet every Thursday you're carrying paint buckets, repairing tables, and helping children clean glue off the floor." Callum gave a quiet laugh. "My uncle thinks I've completely lost my mind." "What do you think?" He turned toward her. "I think I finally found a place where nobody cares about my last name." She looked at him thoughtfully. "You know what I noticed about you? I'm almost afraid to ask. You never introduce yourself as Callum Rourke." He smiled. "I've never needed to." "No." She shook her head gently. "You introduce yourself by helping." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The snow continued drifting around them. Warm light spilled through the community center windows behind them. Finally, Callum broke the silence. "Can I tell you something honestly? You've earned that." He looked directly into her eyes. "I like who I am when I'm here." She waited. "I like who I become when I'm around you." The words were simple. No rehearsed speech. No dramatic declaration. Only quiet honesty. Brielle felt her heartbeat become noticeably faster. She had met men who complimented her appearance. Others praised her smile. Some admired her kindness. None had ever told her she inspired them to become a better person. She lowered her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at him. "Be careful saying things like that." He smiled gently. "I'm not trying to impress you. I know. I'm trying to tell you the truth." For the first time since meeting Callum, Brielle allowed herself to imagine something she had been carefully protecting her heart from. Perhaps this friendship was becoming something neither of them had planned. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt surprisingly peaceful. After that snowy evening outside the community center, nothing officially changed between Brielle and Callum. There were no dramatic confessions, no promises, no awkward conversations about where their friendship was heading. Life simply continued. Yet somehow, every ordinary day became a little brighter. The following Tuesday, Brielle arrived at school to find a small brown paper bag sitting on her classroom desk. There was no expensive logo, no elegant ribbon. Only a handwritten note folded neatly beneath it. "I walked past the bakery you mentioned last Thursday. They had the cinnamon rolls you said reminded you of your mother. I thought today might be a good day for one." "Callum." She smiled before she realized she was smiling. Inside the bag sat one warm cinnamon roll and nothing else. No flowers, No jewelry, no attempt to impress her. Only a simple gesture from someone who had listened. Later that afternoon, she sent him a short message. "You remembered." His reply arrived almost immediately. "You've remembered every child's favorite color. I figured I could remember your favorite breakfast." That made her laugh. Over the following weeks, moments like those quietly became part of their lives. When Callum discovered one of Brielle's students dreamed of becoming an architect, he arrived with several donated design books from a retired engineer instead of buying flashy gifts. When Brielle learned Callum skipped lunch during long board meetings, she started leaving homemade sandwiches at the foundation office reception with his name written on the paper bag. Neither kept score. Neither expected repayment. Kindness simply became the language they spoke most naturally. One Saturday morning, Brielle invited him to a neighborhood farmer's market. "You've probably never shopped somewhere without valet parking," she teased. He laughed. "You enjoy making assumptions about me. I enjoy testing them." The market buzzed with local musicians, handmade crafts, fresh vegetables, homemade jams, and families pushing strollers through narrow paths. Nobody recognized Callum. Nobody cared who his family was. An elderly woman selling fresh peaches offered them both samples. "They're sweeter this year," she said proudly. Callum bought 2 baskets, not because he needed peaches, because she reminded him of his grandmother. Later, while carrying their purchases toward Brielle's car, he looked around the busy market. "I don't think I've smiled this much in months." "You've smiled at least 15 times today." "You counted?" "I teach middle school." She grinned. "I notice everything." He looked at her with quiet admiration. "I believe that." The drive back to Chicago passed with music playing softly through the speakers. Neither of them rushed to fill every silence. They had reached the point where conversation felt effortless, and quiet moments felt equally comfortable. Looking back years later, Brielle would struggle to remember exactly when friendship became something deeper. There was no single day, no grand romantic gesture, no expensive vacation. Love entered their lives through forgotten lunches, handwritten notes, shared laughter, neighborhood markets, and ordinary afternoons that slowly became impossible to imagine without each other. Neither of them realized it yet. They were already building a relationship strong enough to survive beautiful days. Soon, life would test whether it could survive painful ones as well. Brielle had always believed every person needed one friend who loved them enough to disagree. For her, that person was Noemi Vargas. They had met during their first year in Chicago, when a mutual neighbor accidentally delivered one of Brielle's packages to Noemi's apartment. What began as an awkward knock on the wrong door had slowly grown into a friendship built on honesty, laughter, and unwavering loyalty. Noemi worked as a paralegal at a respected law firm downtown. She noticed details most people overlooked, remembered conversations months after they happened, and trusted actions far more than charming words. Every other Friday, the two women met at a small cafe a few blocks from Brielle's apartment. The owner already knew their order: 1 vanilla latte, 1 black coffee, 2 slices of lemon loaf. They always promised to share equally. This Friday felt different. Noemi watched Brielle stir her coffee with an unmistakable smile resting on her face. "You've smiled 3 times without saying anything." Brielle looked up. "Have the first?" "4 now." Brielle laughed. "I've had a good week." "I noticed." Noemi leaned forward. "Does this good week happen to have a name?" Brielle hesitated. "Maybe." "I knew it." She sighed playfully. "His name is Callum." Noemi's expression brightened. "The volunteer from the community center?" "The same one." So, we've been spending more time together." "How much more?" "Coffee before work." "Anything else?" "Saturday farmer's market." Noemi smiled. "I like him already." Brielle nodded. "You would. What does he do?" "He works with his family's foundation." "What family?" Brielle answered without giving the question much thought. "The Rourkes." The smile disappeared from Noemi's face almost instantly. She slowly placed her coffee cup back onto the table. "The Rourkes?" "Yes." "As in the Rourke Hotels?" "I think so." "The Rourke Medical Group?" I believe they own that too. Noemi let out a slow breath. Brielle. Oh, what? You didn't tell me he was one of those Rourkes. I didn't think it mattered. It matters. Why? Because families with that kind of wealth rarely operate like ordinary families. Brielle folded her arms. You're judging him because of his last name. No. I'm asking you to be careful because of his last name. There is a difference. Brielle remained quiet. Noemi continued carefully. I've worked on enough legal files to know what money does to people. It doesn't change everyone. No. It simply gives people more opportunities to become who they already are. She reached across the table and gently squeezed Brielle's hand. I'm not telling you to walk away. What are you telling me? Don't fall in love with who you hope he is. She held Brielle's gaze. Fall in love with who he proves himself to be. Those words stayed with Brielle long after they left the cafe. She trusted Noemi's instincts. She also trusted what she had seen with her own eyes. Callum had never tried to impress her with wealth, never asked her to change, never acted as though money placed him above anyone else. For the first time in years, Brielle found herself caught between two people she respected. One believed in caution. The other had quietly given her every reason to believe. She had no way of knowing that both of them were right. After her conversation with Noemi, Brielle found herself paying closer attention to Callum. Not because she doubted him, because she wanted to understand him. She realized something she hadn't noticed before. Whenever conversations drifted toward his family's wealth, he gently redirected them somewhere else. He would rather ask about Mateo's latest drawing than discuss hotel acquisitions. He remembered the birthdays of children at the community center, but rarely mentioned board meetings. He never pretended his privileged life didn't exist. He simply refused to let it become the most interesting thing about him. One Thursday evening, after the last student had gone home, Brielle found Callum loading several folded tables into a storage closet. You've been avoiding one subject, she said. He looked over his shoulder. Only one? She smiled. Your family. He finished positioning the last table before closing the closet door. What about them? I know almost nothing. I suppose that's true. She waited. Instead of answering immediately, Callum walked toward the small kitchen near the art room and started preparing 2 mugs of tea. You prefer chamomile. She blinked. You remembered? You always choose it after busy Thursdays. He handed her the mug before leaning against the counter. My family has owned businesses for 4 generations. I've heard. My great-grandfather started with one small hotel. And now? Now there are hotels across several states, private medical centers, retirement communities, investment companies. That's quite a journey. It is. His smile faded slightly. People assume growing up around money makes life simple. Didn't it? It made life comfortable. He paused. It didn't always make it peaceful. Brielle listened, without interrupting. My grandfather believes hard work should matter more than family privilege. That sounds reasonable. It does. My uncle disagrees. She noticed the subtle change in his expression whenever he mentioned his uncle. What is he like? Brilliant, he answered honestly. And? He's convinced every decision should increase influence. You don't agree? I think success means very little if you stop recognizing the people standing beside you. Brielle smiled softly. That sounds like something your grandfather would say. He laughed. It probably is. She wrapped both hands around her mug. So, where do you fit into all of this? He looked through the window toward the now empty gymnasium. I've spent most of my life trying to figure that out. For someone with so many opportunities. He finished her sentence. I often feel like my future has already been planned by people who aren't me. Those words surprised her. She had expected confidence. Instead, she found honesty. For the first time, Brielle realized something important. Callum wasn't carrying the weight of his family's fortune. He was carrying the expectations attached to it. That burden couldn't be measured in dollars. It couldn't be solved by another promotion or another business success. It followed him everywhere. Perhaps that explained why he looked so relaxed inside the community center. For a few hours every Thursday, he wasn't the future head of the Rourke empire. He was simply Callum, a volunteer helping children paint their dreams. And Brielle found herself liking that version of him more with every passing week. Spring arrived quietly, replacing cold mornings with warm sunshine and longer evenings. The children at the community center became more energetic, often asking if their art classes could continue outside in the small courtyard behind the building. Brielle happily agreed. One Thursday afternoon, colorful easels lined the sidewalk while students painted flowers, bicycles, passing dogs, and anything else that caught their attention. Callum arrived carrying several folding chairs over one shoulder. "I figured we'd need more seating." Brielle smiled. "You've started anticipating what we need before anyone asks." I've had good teachers." She laughed. "I don't remember teaching that lesson." "You teach it every week." As the children worked, Callum moved from one easel to another, encouraging each student without correcting their creativity. When Lily proudly showed him a bright purple tree, she hesitated. "Trees aren't this color." He looked at her painting. "They are if that's how you see them." She grinned. "I'm keeping it purple." "I hope you do." Across the courtyard, Brielle watched the exchange without realizing she had stopped painting altogether. Mrs. Brooks noticed. "You've been staring at him for almost a minute." Brielle looked away immediately. "I was watching the children." Mrs. Brooks smiled knowingly. "They seem happy." "They do." "I wasn't talking about the children." A warm flush crept across Brielle's cheeks. Before she could respond, Matteo ran over carrying a finished landscape. "Miss Marin." She bent down beside him. "What do you think?" "It's beautiful." "I painted everybody." She looked closer. Every volunteer appeared somewhere in the picture. Mrs. Brooks stood beside the entrance. Several children played soccer. Near the center of the painting stood Brielle and Callum, arranging art supplies together. The two figures were laughing. Matteo pointed proudly. "I drew you two next to each other because you're always together." Neither Brielle nor Callum knew how to answer. The boy simply smiled and ran back to his easel. For the rest of the afternoon, an unusual quietness settled between them. Not uncomfortable, simply thoughtful. As the sun began setting, they packed the remaining supplies into the storage room. Callum finally spoke. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever think about what your life would have looked like if you'd stayed in Ohio?" She paused before answering. "Sometimes." "Do you regret leaving?" She shook her head. "No." "Even after everything you've lost?" She looked toward the courtyard, where several children's paintings still dried on racks. "I miss my parents every day." Her voice softened. "But if I had stayed where grief found me." She smiled gently. "I never would have met these children." She hesitated. "Or you." Callum didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. There was admiration. There was gratitude. There was something else growing quietly beneath both. Neither of them named it. Perhaps they were afraid naming it would change everything. Or perhaps they already knew it had. On the drive home that evening, Brielle caught herself replaying the conversation over and over again. For the first time since losing her parents, someone had become part of her future without asking permission. That realization should have frightened her. Instead, it filled her with a quiet hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. By early summer, Callum had become part of Brielle's daily rhythm in ways she had never planned. He texted her after difficult school days, not with empty comfort, but with questions that made her feel seen. "Which student made you laugh today? Did Matteo finish his skyline sketch? Did Lily keep her tree purple?" Brielle often answered while sitting on her apartment floor, grading art journals with a mug of tea beside her. She found herself waiting for those messages, not desperately, not anxiously, quietly. That was what made it dangerous. Callum never rushed her. He never pushed for labels or made her feel trapped inside expectations. He simply kept showing up with the same steady care he had shown from the beginning. One evening, After helping her carry supplies from the community center to her car, he lingered near the passenger door. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. Brielle looked up. "That sounds serious." "It feels serious." Her smile faded slightly. "What is it?" "My grandfather's birthday dinner is next Saturday." She waited. "It's at the family estate in Lake Forest," he continued. "It's not a public event. No press, no donors, mostly family." "Mostly family," she repeated. "Yes. That sounds like a warning." He gave a small, honest smile. "It might be." Brielle leaned against her car. "You want me to meet them?" "I want them to meet you." Those words landed differently, not like a man showing off a woman, like a man bringing someone important into a guarded part of his life. Still, Noemi's warning returned to her mind. Families with that kind of wealth rarely operate like ordinary families. Callum noticed her hesitation. "You don't have to answer tonight." "I know. And you don't have to come." "I know that too." He stepped back, giving her space before she needed to ask for it. "That house is complicated," he said. "My grandfather is kind. My uncle is not easy. My cousin Sela likes testing people." "That sounds charming." "It isn't." His honesty softened her. "Why invite me then?" His voice lowered. "Because I'm tired of keeping the best part of my life separate from the hardest part." Brielle looked at him for a long moment. The city moved around them. Cars passed. Someone laughed near the center entrance. A child called goodbye from the sidewalk. Her heart understood before her mind agreed. "All right," she said. Callum's face changed. "Really?" "Yes, I'll come." He looked relieved, but he didn't celebrate too quickly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "If your cousin tests me, I might pass in a way nobody likes." For the first time that evening, Callum laughed. "I believe you." As Brielle drove home, she told herself it was only a dinner. One evening, one introduction, one step into his world. She had no idea that the Rourke estate would reveal the first shadow across the love story she had slowly begun to trust. The Rourke estate stood behind tall iron gates in Lake Forest, surrounded by wide lawns, trimmed hedges, and stone paths that looked too perfect to be accidental. As Callum drove through the entrance, Brielle sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the house grow larger through the windshield. It wasn't simply beautiful. It was intimidating. The mansion looked like it had been built to remind visitors that they were entering a world where names mattered, rules were unspoken, and every smile carried a hidden question. Callum noticed her silence. "You okay?" "I'm deciding whether this house welcomes people or interviews them." He laughed softly, but his fingers tightened on the steering wheel. That might be the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about it. Inside, the marble floors shone beneath towering ceilings. Oil paintings lined the walls, each one showing a serious Rourke ancestor staring down like they still expected obedience. A silver-haired man rose from a chair near the fireplace. "Callum." His voice was calm, firm, and warm. Callum stepped forward. "Grandfather, this is Brielle Marin." August Rourke turned to her with clear, searching eyes. "So, this is the teacher." Before Brielle could answer, a sharper voice came from the doorway. "And the volunteer artist, I hear." Oren Quaid entered with a polite smile that never reached his eyes. Behind him stood Sela, elegant and perfectly dressed, studying Brielle from her shoes to her hair. Brielle lifted her chin slightly. "That's right." August smiled. "Good. A woman who answers for herself." For the first time since arriving, Brielle felt she might survive dinner. Dinner began with polished silverware, quiet servants, and a table long enough to make ordinary conversation feel formal. Brielle sat beside Callum, aware of every eye studying her. Sela smiled across the table. "Callum says, you teach art." "I do." "How sweet." The word sounded harmless, but Brielle heard the small cut beneath it. Sela continued, "I always admire people who find joy in simple work." Callum's jaw tightened. Before he could respond, Brielle smiled. "Simple work has a way of revealing complicated people." August looked up from his plate. Oren paused with his glass halfway to his mouth. Sela's smile thinned. Brielle didn't look embarrassed. She hadn't spoken to insult anyone. She had only refused to shrink. August leaned back in his chair. "Tell me, Miss Marin, what does art teach children that exams don't?" Brielle didn't rush her answer. "It teaches them that their voice matters before the world agrees." The table went quiet. Callum turned toward her with pride in his eyes. August studied her for several seconds. Most guests tried to impress him with praise, wealth, or perfect manners. Brielle offered truth. He liked that. "Good," August said at last. "This family has too many people who know how to speak, and too few who know how to say something worth hearing." A faint tension moved through the room. Oren's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes sharpened. Brielle noticed. So did August. And for the first time that night, August Rourke understood why Callum had changed. Dinner continued with polite conversation, but Brielle quickly realized every question carried a purpose. No one asked where she had grown up, simply to know her story. They wanted to know whether she belonged. A woman seated halfway down the table smiled pleasantly. "So Brielle, where did you attend university?" "The University of Cincinnati." "And your parents?" "My mother owned a flower shop." Several guests nodded politely. "My father repaired antique clocks." A brief silence settled over the table. Not because there was anything wrong with her answer, because it wasn't the answer most of them expected. Selah took another sip of her sparkling water. "That must have been quite different from our world." Brielle met her eyes without hesitation. "It was." "And how are you adjusting?" "I'm still learning." Selah smiled again. "I suppose becoming part of this family requires quite an adjustment." "It probably does." Brielle paused just long enough to choose her next words carefully. "But I've never believed people become more valuable because their dining table is larger." Callum looked down, hiding a smile behind his glass. August's eyes sparkled with quiet amusement. Only Oren remained expressionless. He wasn't listening to Brielle's answers anymore. He was studying her. Every response she gave carried confidence without arrogance. She wasn't intimidated by expensive surroundings. She wasn't eager to impress anyone. More importantly, she wasn't interested in pretending to be someone she wasn't. That concerned him. Oren had spent decades understanding people. Some chased approval. Others chased money. Those people were easy to predict. Brielle appeared interested in neither. That made her difficult to influence. As dessert arrived, the conversation shifted toward the family's charitable foundation. One board member proudly listed recent donations and expansion plans. Another spoke about future investment opportunities. August listened quietly. Callum offered thoughtful opinions whenever someone asked. Brielle remained silent. Oren noticed. "You've hardly said anything about the foundation." She looked toward him. "I don't know enough to offer useful opinions. Most people would speak anyway. My father taught me something different." "And what was that?" "If I'm still learning, I'd rather ask questions than pretend I already know the answers." For the first time all evening, Oren felt something he rarely experienced. Concern, not because Brielle challenged him, because she couldn't be controlled through vanity. People who didn't crave status were often the hardest to manipulate. As dinner came to an end, guests slowly stood from the table. Oren watched Brielle laugh with one of the household staff after thanking her for dinner. She spoke to employees exactly the same way she spoke to billionaires. There was no difference. His eyes narrowed slightly. Callum believed he had simply fallen in love with a kind woman. Oren saw something else. If Brielle ever gained influence inside the Rourke family, she could quietly reshape decisions that had benefited him for years. He smiled politely as everyone walked toward the drawing room. Inside his mind, however, a different thought had already taken root. Brielle Marin was no longer simply Callum's girlfriend. She had become a problem he would eventually need to solve. After dinner, August asked if Callum and Brielle would join him in his private study. The room stood at the far end of the west wing, separated from the rest of the house by a long hallway lined with framed photographs of previous generations. Unlike the grand dining room, the study felt lived in. Books filled every wall. A small fireplace burned quietly. Old leather chairs surrounded a wooden desk worn smooth by decades of use. The room carried history, without trying to impress anyone. August closed the door behind them. "You may sit." Brielle and Callum settled onto the sofa across from him. For several moments, August remained silent, turning an old fountain pen between his fingers. Finally, he spoke. "I've reached an age where people have stopped telling me the truth." Neither of them interrupted. They tell me what they believe I want to hear. He smiled faintly. "It becomes rather lonely." His eyes rested on Brielle. "You didn't do that tonight." She answered honestly, "I wasn't trying to impress you." "I know, and I appreciate that." August leaned back in his chair. "You've probably noticed my family isn't uncomplicated." Brielle smiled politely. "I noticed." Callum sighed. "That's putting it kindly." A soft chuckle escaped August. "Money provides comfort." He paused. "It also attracts ambition." His expression became more thoughtful. "Some people begin measuring success by what they own." "I've seen that happen," Brielle replied. "I imagine you have." August folded his hands together. "My late wife used to remind me that wealth is safest when it serves people instead of controlling them." He glanced toward Callum. "I've spent years trying to teach that lesson to my family." "And has it worked?" Brielle asked gently. "With some." His answer carried quiet disappointment. "Not with everyone." He slowly opened a leather folder resting on his desk. "There is something both of you deserve to understand." Callum immediately recognized the folder. "Grandfather." August raised one hand. "No, they should hear it together." He turned toward Brielle. "My personal estate is separate from our businesses." She nodded. "The majority of it will eventually fund the Rourke Legacy Trust." She listened carefully, without fully understanding why he was telling her this. August continued, "I've written one condition into that trust." Callum lowered his eyes. "If Callum wishes to lead it one day, he must build a life independent of family influence." August looked directly at Brielle. "He must marry someone he truly loves." The room became very still. No arranged expectations. No strategic partnerships. No marriage built around business. He closed the folder. "I refuse to leave the future of this family's charitable work in the hands of someone who sees people as investments." Brielle spoke softly. "Sir, I'm honored that you trust me enough to share this." August smiled warmly. "This isn't about trust alone." "It isn't?" "No." He looked toward his grandson. "For the first time in years." His eyes returned to Brielle. "I've watched Callum laugh without pretending." Callum looked embarrassed. August smiled. "You've given him something this family never could." Brielle tilted her head slightly. "And what's that?" "Peace." The words settled quietly inside the room. Neither Brielle nor Callum realized another member of the family had already begun viewing that peace as the greatest threat to his own future. The weeks after visiting the Rourke estate became some of the happiest Brielle had known in years. Nothing about Callum changed. He still volunteered every Thursday, remembered the children's names, and never tried to impress her with his family's wealth. Instead, he continued showing her who he was through quiet consistency. One Friday afternoon, Brielle unlocked her classroom after school and stopped in surprise. Paper stars hung from the ceiling. Student paintings covered every wall. Fresh flowers sat beside the windows, and every desk had been carefully moved aside to create an open space. Her students stood smiling near the whiteboard. Callum stepped forward, looking more nervous than she had ever seen him. "I wanted this place," he said softly, "because this is where I watched you change lives." He reached into his jacket and took out a small velvet box. Then he lowered himself onto one knee. "Brielle Marin, you taught me that love isn't measured by money, status, or family names. It's measured by kindness, honesty, and choosing each other every day. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Brielle's eyes before she could answer. "Yes," she whispered. The classroom erupted in applause as her students celebrated the happiest moment of her life, completely unaware that powerful forces had already begun plotting against the future they were cheering for. At first, wedding planning felt sweet. Brielle wanted a small garden ceremony, soft music, simple flowers, and only the people who truly mattered. Callum agreed. For 1 week, it felt like their dream. Then the Rourke family stepped in. Oren suggested a larger venue. Sela sent guest lists filled with names Brielle had never heard before. Family assistants booked appointments without asking her. By the end of the month, the wedding no longer felt like a promise between two people. It felt like a public event, wearing the mask of romance. Brielle tried to stay calm, but something inside her began paying attention. Callum changed slowly. At first, he missed one dinner. Then, he canceled a weekend at the community center. Then he stopped answering her calls until late at night. Each time, his excuse was the same. Business. Brielle hated that word more every time he used it. Business became the wall between them. Business took his attention. Business stole his warmth. When they sat together, his body stayed beside her, but his mind seemed locked inside another room. He still kissed her forehead. He still said he loved her. But love no longer felt like presence. It felt like something she had to remind him to give. Sela began appearing everywhere. Dress fittings, flower meetings, menu tastings, even private calls with the planner. She never openly insulted Brielle. She did something worse. She made every comment sound helpful. That style is brave. That guest list feels small for this family. You'll learn how things work here. Oren applied pressure in a quieter way. He sent lawyers with documents. He asked Callum for private meetings. He spoke about family duty whenever Brielle entered a room. Brielle felt surrounded by people who never raised their voices, yet somehow made her feel smaller after every conversation. Brielle missed the man who carried paint buckets. She missed the man who remembered cinnamon rolls. She missed the man who listened to children as though their drawings mattered more than any business deal. Now Callum seemed careful with every word. When she asked what was wrong, he smiled too quickly. When she reached for his hand, he held it too loosely. One night, while watching him answer another call outside her apartment, Brielle felt fear settle in her chest. She was still engaged to Callum Rourke, but she was no longer sure she knew him. One rainy evening, Brielle visited the Rourke estate to return old family photographs August had given her for the wedding display. The house felt quiet, too quiet. As she passed the library, she heard Oren's voice through the half-open door. She is useful, Callum, nothing more. Brielle froze. Callum answered, but his voice was low. Oren continued, marry her, secure the trust. After that, a settlement solves the rest. Brielle's breath caught. Then she heard Callum say only one clear sentence. She trusts me. Oren laughed. Then she's perfect. Brielle stepped back, carrying the kind of truth no heart is ready to hold. Brielle drove home with both hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. Oren's words echoed through her mind, refusing to disappear. She wanted to believe she had misunderstood the conversation, yet Callum's quiet reply only deepened her uncertainty. That night, she barely slept. Every happy memory fought against the painful possibility that someone had been using her. By morning, she convinced herself there had to be another explanation. Love had never given her a reason to doubt Callum before. Surely one conversation, heard through a half-open door, couldn't erase everything they had built together. The following evening, Callum arrived at her apartment, carrying fresh flowers from a neighborhood market. He immediately noticed something was wrong. Brielle finally asked the question weighing on her heart. Do you love me? He looked surprised before taking both her hands. More than you know. His answer came without hesitation. He admitted business pressures had overwhelmed him, but insisted nothing had changed between them. His steady voice calmed her fears. Brielle wanted peace more than conflict. Instead of pressing him about the conversation she overheard, she accepted the explanation and chose hope over suspicion. When Brielle shared everything with Noemi, her friend listened without interrupting. She didn't react to one conversation. She reacted to the pattern forming around it. Missed dinners, private meetings, lawyers appearing unexpectedly, wedding plans disappearing from Brielle's control. One warning can be misunderstood, Noemi said calmly. 5 warnings become a pattern. Brielle looked away. I don't want to believe Callum would hurt me. Noemi reached across the table. I'm not asking you to stop loving him. I'm asking you to stop explaining away everything that makes you uncomfortable. Those words stayed with Brielle long after they left the cafe. Brielle bought a simple notebook during her lunch break and carried it everywhere. Every canceled dinner went inside, every unexpected legal document, every conversation interrupted when she entered the room, every promise postponed because of another business meeting. She wasn't collecting evidence against Callum. She was protecting herself from confusion. Whenever doubt crept in, she read her notes instead of trusting emotions alone. The list quietly grew longer each week. Looking at the pages frightened her because they revealed something her heart kept refusing to accept. The distance between them wasn't happening once. It was happening repeatedly. 3 days later, Brielle found a large envelope waiting outside her apartment door. There was no stamp, no return address. Inside lay copies of legal papers she had never seen before. One page described a financial settlement prepared for after the wedding. Another required complete silence regarding family matters. At the bottom, written in red ink, were 6 chilling words. She signs after the wedding ceremony. Brielle read the sentence again and again. Her hands began to shake. Someone had planned her exit before her marriage had even begun. At that moment, hope quietly gave way to truth. Brielle sat alone in her apartment long after sunset, the anonymous envelope still lying open on her coffee table. The papers inside had answered one question while creating 100 more. She reached for the notebook Noemi had encouraged her to keep and slowly turned each page. Missed dinners, last-minute meetings, wedding plans taken out of her hands, strange legal documents, the conversation outside the library. Every page pointed in the same direction. She closed the notebook and rested both hands on it. For weeks, she had been asking herself the wrong question. Instead of asking whether something was wrong, she kept asking whether she was overreacting. There was a difference. Her parents had spent years teaching her to trust honesty, even when honesty hurt. Her father once told her, when the facts keep repeating themselves, don't argue with them simply because your heart wants a different ending. Those words returned with unexpected clarity. Brielle stood, walked to the bedroom mirror, and looked at her reflection. I've been trying to protect the relationship, she whispered. Her voice grew steadier. But who has been protecting me? The answer was painfully simple. No one. If the truth still existed somewhere beneath all the confusion, she would find it herself. For the first time since accepting Callum's proposal, Brielle stopped doubting her instincts. She decided it was time to start trusting them instead. The following morning, Brielle called in a substitute teacher for her afternoon classes. It was the first personal day she had taken since joining Lincoln Grove Middle School. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, not even Noemi. She drove across the city until she found a small, family-owned electronics store tucked between a bookstore and a dry cleaner. It wasn't the kind of place where wealthy clients shopped. The faded sign above the entrance had probably hung there for decades. That was exactly why she chose it. An older gentleman behind the counter looked up as she entered. Good afternoon. How can I help you? Brielle hesitated for only a second. I'm looking for a voice recorder. He nodded without asking unnecessary questions. Something for lectures? She forced a small smile. Something reliable. He placed 3 different models on the counter. This one is simple. He pointed to the smallest device. It records clearly, fits inside a pocket, and the battery lasts several hours. Brielle picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. So small, she murmured. The best tools usually are. She purchased the recorder with cash. No loyalty account. No receipt sent by email. No unnecessary record connecting her to the purchase. Back inside her car, she sat quietly before opening the small box. The recorder rested in her palm like an ordinary object. It didn't look powerful. It didn't look life-changing. She hoped she would never need it. She practiced switching it on, then off, again. By the time she reached home, she could activate it without looking. That evening, she placed it inside the same evening clutch she planned to carry to the engagement gala. For several moments, She stared at the purse resting on her dining table. She wasn't preparing to trap the man she loved. She was preparing to protect the woman she had almost stopped believing. If the coming days proved her fears were wrong, she would gladly delete every recording. If they proved her instincts right, she intended to leave with the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. The engagement gala took place inside the Rourke Grand Hotel, one of the family's most celebrated properties in downtown Chicago. The ballroom looked breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished marble floors. White roses surrounded the stage. A string quartet welcomed arriving guests, while photographers captured every handshake and every carefully rehearsed smile. Magazine reporters stood near the entrance. Business leaders exchanged greetings. Political figures mingled with longtime family friends. To everyone watching, the evening celebrated two people deeply in love. Brielle knew appearances could be convincing. She arrived wearing a simple ivory gown she had chosen months earlier, before the wedding plans stopped feeling like her own. She had refused several designer dresses Selah insisted would be more appropriate. She wanted to look like herself, not like someone the Rourke family had created. As she entered the ballroom, dozens of guests greeted her warmly. "Congratulations. You look beautiful. What a wonderful couple." She thanked each person with the same gracious smile. Only she knew how much effort that smile required. Hidden inside her evening clutch rested the small recorder, already switched on, already listening. Callum crossed the room toward her. For one brief moment, the old warmth returned to his face. "You look amazing." "So do you." "What?" He gently kissed her cheek before another guest interrupted them. Within seconds, someone else needed his attention. Another handshake, another conversation, another business introduction. Brielle watched him disappear into another crowd. Across the ballroom, she noticed Oren speaking quietly with two family attorneys. Neither man smiled. A few feet away, Selah laughed with several socialites, occasionally glancing toward Brielle before quickly looking away again. The room overflowed with music, celebration, and expensive elegance. Yet beneath every pleasant conversation, Brielle sensed something tightening around her. She couldn't explain it. She simply felt it. The recorder continued capturing every passing minute. Her heart quietly reminded her why. As the evening continued, Brielle slowly realized the gala wasn't unfolding naturally. It was unfolding exactly the way Oren wanted. He never raised his voice. He never gave obvious instructions. Yet somehow, everyone seemed to know where they were expected to stand and who they were expected to greet. Reporters were guided toward Callum whenever another influential guest arrived. Family attorneys remained close enough to join private conversations without attracting attention. Business partners appeared one after another, congratulating Callum while discussing future projects in the same breath. Even the photographer seemed to know precisely when to ask Brielle and Callum to stand together. "Just one more picture. Look at each other. Perfect." Callum smiled for every camera. Brielle smiled too. Neither photograph revealed how far apart they had begun to feel. From across the ballroom, Oren watched everything with quiet satisfaction. Whenever Callum drifted toward Brielle, someone interrupted him. A board member, an investor, a family acquaintance. Each interruption lasted only a few minutes. Together, they kept Brielle standing alone far longer than she should have been. She noticed the pattern. So did Noemi, who had accepted Brielle's invitation weeks earlier. She quietly approached carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. "Have you spoken to him for more than 5 minutes all night?" Brielle thought about it. "No." "And whose idea was this guest list?" "Oren's." Noemi followed Brielle's eyes toward the older man. "He isn't hosting an engagement celebration." "What do you mean?" Controlling the room." Brielle watched Oren greet another influential guest before gently directing him toward Callum. Nothing looked unusual. Everything looked intentional. For the first time that evening, Brielle felt less like the bride-to-be and more like someone being carefully positioned inside another person's plan. Before she could say another word, Oren approached with his familiar polished smile. "Brielle." She turned toward him. "You've been looking for Callum." "I was." He'd like a private moment with you before the final toast. Her heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. A private moment? Oren nodded. Just the two of you. Then, with perfect calm, he pointed toward the marble hallway outside the ballroom. He's waiting for you there. Brielle watched Oren disappear back into the ballroom before tightening her grip on the small evening clutch resting against her side. Her heart beat steadily, not because she felt calm, because she had already prepared herself for whatever came next. Without drawing attention, she slipped her hand inside the clutch and pressed the recorder's button one final time. A tiny light blinked once. It was recording. She quietly walked toward the marble hallway. Every step carried the weight of unanswered questions. As the ballroom doors closed behind her, the music became distant, replaced by the soft echo of her heels against the polished floor. The hallway stood empty. Tall mirrors reflected rows of white roses placed along the walls. At the far end, Callum stood alone. His hands rested inside his pockets as he stared toward one of the windows overlooking the city. When he heard her footsteps, he slowly turned. "There you are," he said. "You wanted to see me." "I did." For several seconds, neither of them moved. Brielle searched his face, hoping to find the man who had once carried paint buckets, laughed with children, and believed small acts of kindness mattered more than expensive gifts. She wanted one reason to silence every fear growing inside her. Instead, she found a man carrying a burden she could no longer understand. She stopped only a few feet away. "You've been avoiding me all evening." "I know. You've been avoiding me for weeks." He lowered his eyes. "I know." She drew a slow breath. "Then don't avoid me now." Callum glanced toward the ballroom entrance before taking one careful step closer. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Brielle." She met his eyes without looking away. "No more half-truths. No more excuses. Whatever you're carrying." Her fingers quietly tightened around the recorder, hidden inside her purse. "Tell me the truth." For the first time since they met, Callum's expression revealed something she had never seen before. Not fear, not guilt. A painful decision. He stepped closer until only inches separated them. The next words he spoke would change both of their lives forever. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. The music from the ballroom drifted faintly through the closed doors, almost mocking the silence between them. Callum lowered his eyes before looking directly at Brielle again. "You wanted the truth," he said quietly. "Yes." She didn't blink. She didn't move. She simply waited. He drew a slow breath, as though forcing himself to continue. "I only keep you around for the inheritance." The sentence landed with astonishing calm. There was no shouting, no anger, only words spoken so softly that anyone walking past would have mistaken them for something affectionate. Hidden inside Brielle's evening clutch, the recorder captured every syllable. For one brief moment, her heartbeat seemed to disappear. Not because she hadn't feared hearing those words, because hearing them removed every excuse she had been giving herself for months. The canceled dinners, the unexplained meetings, the legal papers, the distance, the conversation outside the library. Every unanswered question suddenly had the same answer. Callum continued speaking, unaware that the tiny recorder preserved each sentence. "My grandfather believes I'm in love with you." His voice remained steady. "He believes our marriage proves I've chosen people over power." Brielle swallowed carefully. "So none of this was real?" His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "I didn't say that." "Then tell me what you're saying." He looked toward the ballroom entrance before lowering his voice even further. "I'm saying everything became complicated after my grandfather changed the terms of the trust." "The trust." She repeated the word slowly, not because she hadn't heard it before, because she finally understood where she stood in the conversation, not as a woman, not as a future wife, as a condition, as part of an agreement. She held his gaze. "You had countless opportunities to tell me the truth." He remained silent. "You let me choose flowers." Silence. "You watched me try on wedding dresses." Silence. "You stood inside my classroom and promised we'd build a home together." Still, Silence. For the first time since they met, Brielle realized the silence hurt more than the confession itself. Words could wound. Silence confirmed them. She tightened her grip on the clutch resting against her side. The recorder continued faithfully capturing every second. She no longer needed another explanation. She needed one final piece of courage. The courage to stop asking someone else to tell her what she already knew. Brielle's fingers tightened around the evening clutch resting against her side. The recorder continued capturing every word. She wasn't thinking about revenge. She wasn't thinking about headlines. She was thinking about clarity. For weeks, she had questioned her own instincts. She had replayed conversations, defended Callum to Noemi, and convinced herself there had to be another explanation. Now the explanation stood directly in front of her. Callum looked away first. I never wanted this to happen like this. Like what? You hearing it? Brielle held his gaze. Not hearing it. She paused. Living it. A flicker of regret crossed his face, but it disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Before she could speak again, something caught her attention. Behind Callum, one of the tall marble mirrors reflected the entrance to the hallway. Someone stood there, still, watching. Brielle focused without moving her head. Oren, half concealed beside the ballroom doors. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't confused. He looked like a man waiting for a meeting to end exactly as planned. Her heartbeat slowed. Everything suddenly made sense. The endless interruptions throughout the gala, the carefully arranged photographs, the private invitation into the hallway. Even this conversation, Oren wanted Callum to say these words. Whether Callum had spoken from fear, weakness, or misplaced loyalty no longer mattered. No one had forced the sentences from his mouth. They belonged to him. Brielle looked back at Callum. You weren't the only person in this conversation. His forehead creased. What do you mean? She didn't answer. There was no reason to reveal what she had seen. Oren believed he remained invisible. She intended to keep it that way. Callum took one hesitant step forward. Brielle, please say something. She studied the man she had planned to marry. The man who had once carried paint buckets through the community center without caring about his expensive clothes. The man who remembered cinnamon rolls because they reminded her of her mother. The man who had knelt inside her classroom and promised to build a life with her. She could still see pieces of him, but they were buried beneath choices he had made himself. A painful truth settled over her. People are rarely destroyed by one terrible decision. They are changed by the smaller decisions they continue defending afterward. She drew one slow breath. Then she spoke with remarkable calm. Thank you. Callum stared at her. His expression shifted from confusion to concern. For what? For finally giving me the truth I couldn't give myself. Without another word, Brielle turned toward the ballroom doors. Behind her, Callum called her name. She didn't stop walking. Callum reached toward her instinctively. Brielle, please. She took one small step backward, not out of fear, out of clarity. For months, she had stood beside him, believing they were walking toward the same future. Now she understood they had been walking toward two completely different destinations. One built on love, the other built on obligation. She looked at the engagement ring resting on her finger. Only weeks earlier, it had filled her with excitement. Now, it felt strangely heavy, not because of the diamond, because of everything attached to it. Callum rubbed a hand across his face. I know how this sounds. No. Her voice remained remarkably steady. I don't think you do. He stared at her. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did. I was trying to protect. She gently interrupted him. Please, don't tell me you were protecting me. The words stopped him immediately. You don't protect someone by building a future on half-truths. She swallowed carefully before continuing. You protect them by giving them the chance to choose. For the first time all evening, Callum had no answer. Brielle realized she wasn't angry. She was disappointed. There was a difference. Anger demanded revenge. Disappointment simply accepted reality. She drew a slow breath. My father repaired clocks for almost 40 years. Callum looked at her, confused by the sudden change in subject. He used to tell me that broken clocks aren't dangerous. She paused. They're obvious. What becomes dangerous? Her eyes never left his. Are clocks that lose only a minute at a time. He remained silent. They seem trustworthy. They almost tell the correct time. But, eventually. She glanced briefly at the engagement ring. They lead you somewhere you never intended to go. A painful understanding settled between them. This conversation wasn't about one sentence. It wasn't even about the inheritance. It was about every opportunity Callum had to choose honesty. And every time he decided to wait until tomorrow. Brielle closed her fingers around the clutch. The recorder continued preserving every word. She knew what she needed to do next. For herself. For the truth. For every young girl who might one day believe love required accepting less than honesty. Without another word, she turned toward the ballroom doors. This time, she wasn't walking away from Callum. She was walking back toward everyone who deserved to hear the truth. The ballroom doors opened quietly. Conversation continued for another few seconds before guests noticed Brielle walking back inside alone. The string quartet continued playing. Waiters moved between tables, carrying champagne. Photographers adjusted their cameras, expecting another smiling photograph of the happy couple. Instead, Brielle walked with calm, measured steps toward the small stage near the center of the room. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't trying to escape. She looked like a woman who had finally stopped carrying a weight that never belonged to her. Several guests exchanged puzzled glances. Where's Callum? Is everything all right? Nobody answered. Brielle reached the stage and accepted the wireless microphone resting beside the podium. The musicians slowly lowered their instruments. The room became quiet. Nearly every face turned toward her. Across the ballroom, Oren immediately straightened. For the first time that evening, uncertainty crossed his face. This wasn't part of the evening he had arranged. A few moments later, Callum entered through the hallway doors. His eyes immediately found Brielle standing on the stage. He stopped walking. His expression changed. He understood something was about to happen. Brielle looked across the room. Business leaders, family friends, teachers from her school, community volunteers, children's parents, people who had come believing they were celebrating a love story. She drew one steady breath. I want to thank every one of you for being here tonight. Her voice remained calm. I know many of you traveled a long way because you believed you were witnessing the beginning of a beautiful marriage. She paused briefly. So did I. The silence deepened. No one reached for a glass. No one whispered. Every eye remained fixed on her. Brielle slowly removed the engagement ring from her finger. The diamond reflected the ballroom lights one final time before resting quietly in the palm of her hand. I've learned something tonight. She looked toward Callum. Love without honesty isn't love. Her eyes moved across the room again. It is simply a performance. No one spoke. No one moved. And I refuse to spend the rest of my life performing happiness while my dignity quietly disappears. She gently closed her hand around the ring. The room remained completely still. For many guests, it was the first time they had ever seen someone choose self-respect over appearances. And Brielle wasn't finished speaking. Brielle slowly opened her hand and placed the engagement ring on the podium beside the microphone. The tiny sound it made against the polished wood echoed through the silent ballroom. No one expected the evening to continue this way. She looked directly at Callum. Her eyes held sadness, not hatred, not bitterness, only the quiet acceptance that comes after the truth has finally been spoken. I loved you, she said. Her voice remained steady enough for every guest to hear. I loved the man who volunteered at a community center after long workdays. She paused. The man who remembered my mother's favorite cinnamon rolls. Another pause. The man who carried paint buckets without caring what happened to his expensive suit. A few guests exchanged confused looks. Brielle continued. I believe that man wanted to build a life with me. She looked down briefly before raising her eyes again. Tonight, I discovered something very different. Callum took one hesitant step forward. Brielle. She gently lifted one hand. Please. He stopped immediately. I've spent weeks wondering whether my instincts had failed me. She looked around the ballroom. They hadn't. They were simply waiting for me to believe them. Her eyes settled on the crowd. There are young women in this room. There are young men in this room. There are families who have spent years teaching their children what respect looks like. She smiled sadly. I refuse to stand here pretending that promises mean nothing, simply because breaking them benefits powerful people. A quiet murmur moved through the audience. Several people turned toward Oren. Others looked back at Callum. Neither man spoke. Brielle picked up the ring one last time before placing it into Callum's hand. I won't marry someone who sees me as the path to an inheritance. The words landed with unmistakable force. Several guests gasped. Others stared in complete disbelief. Across the ballroom, Oren's confident expression finally disappeared. August slowly rose from his chair. His face had lost every trace of color. He looked first at Callum, then at the ring resting in his grandson's trembling hand. Finally, he looked at Brielle. In that moment, he understood that something far greater than an engagement had ended. The image the Rourke family had spent generations protecting had begun to crack. Without another word, Brielle stepped away from the podium. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't wait for explanations. She didn't wait for anyone to stop her. She walked through the center of the ballroom with her head held high. Every guest silently moved aside, creating a path toward the exit. The same woman who had entered hoping to celebrate her future left carrying something far more valuable, her self-respect. The morning after the gala, Brielle woke before sunrise. For several minutes, she lay quietly in bed, staring at the ceiling of her apartment. The silence felt unfamiliar after the whirlwind of the previous evening. Her phone had vibrated throughout the night, but she hadn't answered a single call. She already knew what people wanted. Explanations, interviews, a public response. She wanted something entirely different. Peace. The small recorder rested on her bedside table. It looked exactly the same as it had the day she bought it. Only now, it carried the conversation that had ended her engagement. Brielle reached for it carefully. She pressed play for only a few seconds before switching it off again. She didn't need to hear the words another time. They were already carved into her memory. Around mid-morning, Noemi knocked on the apartment door carrying 2 coffees and a folder. You haven't checked your phone, have you? She asked. Brielle shook her head. I don't think I'm ready. You don't need to be. Noemi placed the folder on the kitchen table. I've already spoken with someone. A lawyer? The best one I know. Brielle looked at the recorder. People will expect me to release this. They will. But I don't want my heartbreak becoming entertainment. Noemi smiled gently. Then don't give it to strangers. She tapped the folder. Give it to someone whose job is protecting you. An hour later, Brielle sat inside a quiet law office overlooking downtown Chicago. Attorney Evelyn Harper listened without interrupting as Brielle described everything from the library conversation to the marble hallway. When Brielle finally placed the recorder on the desk, Evelyn didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, she asked one simple question. What outcome are you hoping for? Brielle thought for a long moment. I don't want revenge. She spoke with complete certainty. I want the truth documented. Evelyn nodded. Those are 2 very different goals. They are. I have no interest in destroying anyone. She looked toward the recorder. I only want to make sure no one can rewrite what happened. Evelyn finally picked up the recorder. Then we'll begin there. For the first time since leaving the ballroom, Brielle felt something inside her grow lighter. She hadn't chosen headlines. She had chosen dignity. And that decision would shape everything that followed. 3 days after the engagement gala, August Rourke requested a private meeting. Not with Callum, not with the family board, with Brielle. She almost declined. The thought of returning to the Rourke estate exhausted her before she even left her apartment. Every hallway inside that mansion reminded her of promises that no longer existed. Noemi gently encouraged her. This meeting isn't about going back. It's about closing a door the right way. Late that afternoon, Brielle arrived at the estate carrying nothing except her handbag and the confidence she had fought to rebuild. August greeted her himself. He looked older than he had only a week earlier. His shoulders seemed heavier. His smile had disappeared. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure I should." "I understand." He led her into the same study where they had once discussed the future with hope. This time, the room felt painfully different. Neither of them sat immediately. August broke the silence. "My attorney told me you have a recording." Brielle nodded. "I do. I would like to hear it." She hesitated, not because she wanted to protect Callum, because reliving the moment would hurt all over again. Finally, she placed the recorder on the desk. "I never intended for anyone outside my legal team to hear this." "I know, but you deserve the truth." August pressed the play button himself. The room filled with familiar voices. Callum, Brielle, every heartbreaking sentence. Neither of them spoke while the recording played. When it finally ended, August remained completely still. His eyes rested on the recorder for several long moments. Then he quietly removed his glasses. "I failed." His voice barely rose above a whisper. Brielle looked at him with compassion. "You didn't say those words." "No." He slowly nodded. "But I allowed a family culture where someone believed they could." His eyes filled with disappointment. "I built companies. I built hospitals. I built charities." He looked around the study, and somewhere along the way, his voice faltered. "I stopped seeing what was happening inside my own home." Brielle felt no satisfaction, only sadness. August looked at her with sincere regret. "You entered this family with honesty. We repaid you with manipulation." "I'm deeply sorry." For the first time since the engagement ended, Brielle believed someone inside the Rourke family truly understood the damage that had been done. Not to the family's reputation, to a human heart. August slowly stood and walked toward the window. Without turning around, he spoke one final sentence. "By tomorrow morning." His voice regained its quiet authority. "Everything inside this family will change." The following Monday, the Rourke family headquarters felt unusually quiet. Employees moved through the building, speaking in lowered voices. Board members arrived earlier than normal, each carrying folders instead of casual conversation. Rumors had already spread through every department. An emergency family meeting had been called. Callum entered the boardroom expecting another discussion about damage control. Instead, August was already seated at the head of the table. The elderly businessman looked calm. Calmer than anyone expected. Oren smiled confidently as he took his usual seat. "I assume we're here to discuss the unfortunate misunderstanding at the gala." August looked directly at him. "No. This meeting is about honesty." The room became silent. August slowly placed the recorder on the conference table. Callum immediately recognized it. The color drained from his face. Oren's confident smile disappeared. Without saying another word, August pressed the play button. Every person inside the room listened. No interruptions, no explanations, only the quiet voices from the marble hallway. "I only keep you around for the inheritance." No one looked at Callum. No one needed to. The recording continued until the final sentence faded into silence. August switched the recorder off. "I spent my entire life believing our family name represented integrity." His voice remained steady. "I refuse to let deception become part of that legacy." He turned toward Oren. "You used my trust to manipulate my grandson." Oren leaned forward. "I was protecting the family." "You were protecting yourself." August's reply came without hesitation. "You treated another human being as though she were a business strategy." Oren opened his mouth to respond. August raised one hand. "I'm not finished." He reached for a prepared folder resting beside him. "Effective immediately, you are removed from every leadership position within the Rourke Legacy Trust." The words landed like stone. Several board members looked at one another in stunned silence. Oren stood abruptly. "You can't seriously." I already have. August's voice remained calm. You will surrender every committee responsibility before the end of today. Oren looked around the room, searching for support. No one spoke. No one defended him. Then August turned toward Callum. His expression softened, but only slightly. My disappointment in you is different. Callum lowered his eyes. I know. You weren't manipulated into speaking those words. No. You chose them. Callum nodded slowly. I did. August closed the folder. The inheritance you hoped to receive. He paused. Will no longer be yours to manage. The room fell completely silent. Callum didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. For the first time in his life, he understood that the greatest thing he had lost wasn't money. It was the trust of the people who had once believed in him most. The weeks that followed tested Brielle in ways she had never imagined. Her story spread far beyond the ballroom. Guests talked. Newspapers published headlines about the broken engagement. Television hosts speculated about the powerful Rourke family. People who had never met Brielle suddenly believed they understood her life. She ignored every request for interviews. She declined every television appearance. Even when reporters waited outside Lincoln Grove Middle School, she quietly entered through the staff entrance and continued teaching as though nothing had happened. Her students remained her priority. One afternoon, Mateo noticed she seemed quieter than usual. Miss Marin? She smiled. Yes? Are you okay? She looked at the drawing he was working on. I will be. The little boy nodded. My grandma says broken hearts heal slower than broken bones. Brielle smiled through misty eyes. Your grandma sounds very wise. She also says people who stay kind after being hurt are the strongest. Those simple words stayed with Brielle for the rest of the day. Instead of hiding at home every evening, she returned to the community center, not because it erased the pain, because it reminded her who she was before heartbreak entered her life. She painted beside the children, laughed at Lily's colorful imagination, helped Mateo prepare artwork for a citywide student exhibition. Life didn't suddenly become easy. Some mornings, she still reached for her phone before remembering there would be no message from Callum. Some evenings, she still drove past places they once visited together. Healing wasn't immediate. It arrived one ordinary day at a time. Noemi remained beside her through every difficult week. You know what's different? Noemi asked one evening while they closed the art room. What? You're smiling again. Brielle looked around the room filled with children's paintings. I forgot that happiness doesn't have to come from one person. Noemi smiled. It never did. For the first time in months, Brielle believed her future hadn't ended. It had simply begun again. This time, on her own terms. Several months after the engagement ended, Brielle opened the closet she had avoided since the gala. At the very back hung her wedding dress, still covered, still untouched. For a long time she simply stood there. The dress no longer represented the future she had imagined. It represented a chapter that had ended before it ever truly began. Noemi, who had stopped by that afternoon, quietly walked into the room. You don't have to keep it. I know. You don't have to destroy it either. Brielle looked at the gown. Then an unexpected thought came to her. What if I transformed it? Noemi smiled. Into what? The truth. The following Saturday, Brielle carried the dress into the art room at the community center. The children had already gone home, leaving the building peaceful and quiet. She carefully spread the fabric across a large canvas table. Using scissors, she removed small sections of lace and satin. Not out of anger, out of purpose. She painted across the canvas with deep blues, warm golds, soft whites, and rich earth tones. Pieces of the wedding dress became part of the artwork itself, stitched into layers of paint that told a different story. It wasn't a painting about heartbreak. It was a painting about survival, about choosing honesty over comfort, about refusing to let disappointment become the final chapter. When the piece was finished, Brielle gave it a simple title, Still Standing. Weeks later, the painting was displayed during the community center's annual student exhibition. Visitors stopped in front of it for long moments. Some admired the colors. Others noticed the fabric woven into the artwork. Few knew the full story behind it. Brielle preferred it that way. As she stood quietly near the back of the gallery, watching families smile and children proudly explain their own artwork, she realized something important. The woman who had walked into the engagement gala, hoping to become someone's wife, no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who had rediscovered herself. She hadn't won because someone else lost. She had won because she refused to lose herself. And for the first time in many months, when she looked toward the future, she smiled without pretending. Nearly 6 months had passed since the engagement gala. Autumn had returned to Chicago, covering sidewalks with golden leaves and filling the air with the familiar chill that always reminded Brielle another school year was well underway. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Her mornings belonged to Lincoln Grove Middle School. Her Thursday evenings still belonged to the Harper Community Center. Nothing about her routine revolved around the Rourke family anymore. That was exactly how she wanted it. Late one Thursday afternoon, Brielle stood beside Lily, helping her mix watercolor paints for an autumn landscape. "Remember," she said with a smile, "there isn't one correct shade for leaves." Lily nodded seriously. "My tree gets to choose." "Exactly." A gentle knock sounded against the open classroom door. Mrs. Brooks stepped inside. "Brielle," she turned. "Yes?" "Someone is here asking to see you." "Who?" Mrs. Brooks hesitated before answering. "It's Callum." The paintbrush slipped slightly in Brielle's hand. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for her to feel it. She looked toward the hallway. Through the glass window, she saw him standing alone near the reception desk. He looked different. His tailored suits had been replaced by a simple navy sweater and dark trousers. His shoulders seemed heavier. His expression carried none of the confidence she remembered. Most noticeably, he had arrived empty-handed. No flowers, no gifts, no carefully prepared speech waiting inside an expensive box. Mrs. Brooks lowered her voice. "I told him I would ask before bringing him back." Brielle appreciated that. "Did he say why he's here?" "He said only one thing." "What?" "He said he isn't expecting forgiveness." Brielle looked through the window again. Callum wasn't pacing. He wasn't checking his phone. He simply stood quietly, hands folded in front of him, patiently waiting for whatever answer she chose to give. Months earlier, she would have searched his face for reassurance. Today, she searched for something different. Responsibility. She handed Lily another paintbrush. "I'll be back in a few minutes." The little girl smiled. "Okay, Miss Marin." Taking one slow breath, Brielle walked toward the hallway. She wasn't walking to reopen the past. She was walking to hear something she should have heard many months earlier. The complete truth. Mrs. Brooks quietly closed the office door behind them, giving both of them the privacy they needed. For several moments, neither Brielle nor Callum spoke. Children's laughter drifted faintly from the art room down the hall, reminding them both that life had continued, even after everything that had happened. Callum was the first to break the silence. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." "I almost didn't." "I wouldn't have blamed you." Brielle folded her hands together. "You said you wanted to tell me something." "I do." He drew a slow breath. "I've replayed that night 1,000 times." She remained silent. "There isn't a version where I become the man I wanted to be." His honesty surprised her. Not because she believed it erased the past. Because it was the first time he wasn't trying to soften what he had done. Callum continued. "My uncle began preparing me years before I met you." Brielle listened carefully. "He constantly reminded me that family legacy came before personal feelings. He said love changes. He said business decisions last forever." His eyes lowered. I believed him. He gave a quiet, bitter laugh. "I thought I was being practical." "You weren't." "No. I was becoming someone I barely recognized." He looked directly at her. The inheritance wasn't only about money. It was about responsibility. My grandfather planned for me to oversee every charitable program the family had built. I convinced myself that if I protected that future. He paused. I could somehow fix everything later. Brielle finally spoke. So, you lied first, and planned to apologize afterward. He nodded without hesitation. Yes. The single word carried more weight than any excuse ever could. I kept telling myself there would be a better moment to tell you. But every day I waited. His voice became quieter. Telling the truth became harder. Brielle looked at him steadily. No. She shook her head. It became more expensive. Callum closed his eyes briefly. You're right. I wasn't protecting our future. I was protecting my comfort. The admission hung between them. Months earlier, Brielle would have argued. She would have searched for another explanation. Today, she simply listened. For the first time, Callum wasn't asking her to understand his decisions. He was finally taking ownership of them. That, more than anything else, was the conversation she had deserved from the beginning. The room remained quiet after Callum's confession. Neither of them felt the need to rush the silence. For the first time in many months, there was nothing left to hide. Callum reached into the worn leather messenger bag resting beside his chair. Brielle instinctively looked at it. He noticed. It's not a gift. He carefully placed several folders on the table between them. I brought these because I thought you deserved to see them. She didn't touch them immediately. What are they? The resignation letters. She looked up. I resigned from every position connected to the Rourke Legacy Trust. You didn't have to. I know. I also stepped down from 3 company boards. Brielle stared at him. Why? Because every meeting reminded me of the choices I made. He slid another document toward her. I've transferred my voting rights to an independent committee until my grandfather decides what happens next. She slowly opened one folder. Every page carried official signatures. Nothing had been prepared overnight. The process had taken weeks. You've already done this. He nodded. Months ago. And you never told me. I wasn't trying to impress you. He gave a tired smile. If I needed you to know before doing the right thing. Then, I was still doing it for myself. Those words caught Brielle's attention. He continued. I sold the apartment we planned to live in. Her eyes widened slightly. The money paid for a scholarship fund. For whom? The students at Harper Community Center. He smiled faintly. It's anonymous. No building carries my name. No newspaper covered it. I wanted at least one decision in my life to help people without benefiting me. Brielle closed the folder gently. For months, she had wondered whether Callum regretted losing the inheritance. Now she understood something different. He regretted losing himself. I can't change what I said in that hallway. He looked directly at her. I can't erase what I put you through. And I won't ask you to forgive me today. He stood slowly. I only wanted you to know that I'm trying to become the man you believed I was. Brielle looked at him for several long seconds. This wasn't the confident businessman she had met years ago. This was a man carrying the full weight of his own decisions. For the first time since the engagement ended, she believed his remorse wasn't measured by words. It was measured by the life he had quietly begun rebuilding. Brielle remained seated for several moments after Callum finished speaking. Her eyes rested on the document spread across the table. 6 months earlier, she would have searched those pages for proof that he still loved her. Today, she looked for something far more important. Integrity. She slowly closed the final folder and looked up. I've been waiting for this conversation. Callum nodded. I know, not because I wanted an apology. He listened quietly. I wanted to know whether you understood what you took from me. His expression grew solemn. I do now. You didn't only break my trust. You made me question my own judgment. Her voice stayed calm, but every word carried quiet weight. For weeks, I thought something was wrong. I ignored it. I defended you. I even convinced myself I was imagining things. She lowered her eyes briefly. That was the hardest part to recover from. Callum didn't interrupt. He accepted every sentence without trying to soften it. I know, no. She gently shook her head. You know it happened. But now. She looked directly into his eyes. I believe you finally understand how it felt. He swallowed hard. I do, and I would give anything to undo it. She offered a faint, thoughtful smile. That's the difference. He looked confused. What difference? The old Callum always wanted to undo the consequences. She paused. The man sitting in front of me accepts them. Silence settled between them again. Not uncomfortable, simply honest. Brielle realized she no longer felt the anger that had once consumed her. The hurt remained. The memories remained. But the anger had quietly made room for something else. Understanding. Not understanding his decisions. Understanding his growth. People often apologized because they wanted another opportunity. Callum hadn't asked for one. He hadn't hinted at one. He hadn't even suggested they could begin again. Instead, he had accepted that some mistakes leave permanent marks. And he had chosen to become a better man anyway. For Brielle, that was something entirely new. For the first time since the engagement ended, she wasn't looking at the man who had betrayed her. She was looking at a man who had stopped running from the truth. Whether that changed their future, she still didn't know. But it changed this moment, and for now, that was enough. Callum slowly gathered the folders from the table, leaving only one behind. Brielle looked down. What is this? A list of the scholarship recipients. She opened the first page. Every student came from neighborhoods where families struggled to afford school supplies, tutoring, or after-school activities. She immediately recognized several names: Mateo, Lily, 2 children from the music program, another from the science club. None of them knew who had paid for their education. They'll never know it came from you, Brielle said quietly. I don't want them to. He smiled faintly. They deserve the opportunity. They don't owe me gratitude. Brielle closed the folder. You've changed. Callum looked toward the classroom, where children continued laughing. I'm trying to. You are. The words escaped before she had time to reconsider them. He met her eyes. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Callum nodded. Thank you. She looked surprised. For what? For noticing. He slipped the empty messenger bag over his shoulder. I didn't come here hoping we'd start over. No, I didn't come hoping you'd forgive me. I know. I only came because you deserved the complete truth. He walked toward the office door before stopping one final time. Without turning around, he spoke softly. I hope life gives you every happiness I failed to protect. Then he opened the door. Children's laughter immediately filled the hallway again. One little boy nearly ran into him while carrying a colorful painting. I'm sorry, mister. Callum smiled and knelt to pick up the paper that had fallen. No harm done. He carefully handed it back. It's a beautiful painting. The boy grinned and hurried away. Callum watched him for a second before quietly leaving the community center. He never looked back. He never asked Brielle to follow him. He never asked whether she still loved him. Outside, the autumn wind carried fallen leaves across the sidewalk as he disappeared into the afternoon crowd. Standing near the office window, Brielle watched until he was no longer in sight. For the first time since the engagement ended, she understood something her mother had once tried to teach her. Real change doesn't announce itself. It quietly appears in the choices people continue making after no one is watching. Callum had finally become accountable. Whether that would ever be enough to rebuild what had been broken remained unknown. But as Brielle returned to her students with a peaceful heart instead of lingering questions, she realized something important. The truth had finally set both of them free. The open room began as one Saturday workshop inside the Harper Community Center. Brielle didn't want it to feel like school. She wanted it to feel like a place where children could breathe. The program offered art, public speaking, money lessons, journaling, and conversations about confidence, boundaries, and self-worth. She created it for children who needed more than homework help. Some needed language for their feelings. Some needed adults who listened without rushing them. Some needed proof that their dreams mattered even when life felt uncertain. On the first Saturday, only 12 children arrived. Brielle didn't feel disappointed. 12. was enough. She arranged sketch pads on one table, paints on another, and a large sign near the door that read, "Your voice matters here." Noemi helped with registration, while Mrs. Brooks welcomed parents. By noon, the room filled with color, laughter, questions, and shy smiles slowly becoming confident ones. Brielle stood near the doorway, watching children create without fear of being judged. For the first time, her pain felt useful. The engagement had ended. The wedding had disappeared. But something better had grown from the space it left behind. 3 weeks after the open room welcomed its first group of children, Brielle arrived early on a Saturday morning carrying 2 boxes of art supplies. She unlocked the front door expecting to be the first person there. Instead, she found someone arranging folding tables inside the main activity room. Callum. He looked up briefly before returning to his work. "Good morning." Brielle stopped in the doorway. "I didn't know you were coming. I asked Mrs. Brooks if she needed another volunteer." "You asked her?" He nodded. "I told her not to mention it to you." She set the boxes on a nearby table. "Why?" "Because I didn't want you to feel obligated to say yes." He carefully unfolded another table before continuing. "If you had asked me to leave, I would have." Brielle studied him quietly. Nothing about him resembled the man who once tried to control outcomes. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to place himself at the center of the room. He had simply arrived early and started working. By the time the children entered, Callum had already arranged chairs, prepared painting stations, tested the projector, and repaired a loose shelf in the reading corner. No one had asked him to do any of it. Throughout the morning, he remained in the background. When Lily struggled to build a cardboard bridge during a teamwork exercise, he knelt beside her. "What do you think is missing?" She frowned. "It keeps falling." Instead of taking the project from her, he smiled. "What could make it stronger?" The little girl studied it for another minute. "The bottom needs more support." "I think you're right." She added another strip of cardboard. The bridge stayed standing. "I did it!" "You certainly did." He never claimed credit. He simply celebrated her success. Across the room, Brielle watched without saying a word. The old Callum enjoyed solving problems himself. The new Callum helped other people solve them instead. That quiet difference spoke louder than any apology ever could. As autumn slowly gave way to winter, Saturdays developed a comfortable rhythm. Children arrived carrying backpacks filled with unfinished drawings and stories they couldn't wait to share. Parents greeted the volunteers by name. The open room had quietly become part of the neighborhood. Brielle and Callum worked together every weekend, but neither of them forced conversations. Healing didn't happen through dramatic speeches. It happened while washing paintbrushes, stacking chairs, organizing books, and cleaning tables after the children went home. One Saturday afternoon they remained behind after everyone else had left. Callum carefully wiped paint from a wooden table, while Brielle organized brushes by size. She smiled without looking up. "You've become surprisingly good at cleaning acrylic paint." He laughed softly. "I've had excellent teachers." She glanced at him. "You still remember that?" "I remember a lot of things." Silence settled comfortably between them. Not awkward, not uncertain, simply peaceful. A few moments later, Brielle broke the silence. "I used to replay that night at the gala, almost every day." Callum stopped wiping the table. "I know, I don't anymore." He slowly looked up. "What changed?" She thought about the question before answering. "I stopped asking why it happened, and started asking what I wanted my life to become afterward." Callum nodded quietly. "I wish I had learned that lesson sooner." "You have learned it." He looked down at the cloth in his hands. "It cost too much." Brielle walked over and stood beside him. "Some lessons do." Neither of them spoke for several moments. The room around them carried reminders of new beginnings. Fresh paintings dried along one wall. Children's handwritten goals covered another. Everywhere Brielle looked, she saw growth instead of loss. She finally realized something important. The conversations between her and Callum no longer revolved around the past. They revolved around becoming better people than they had been before. For the first time in years, neither of them felt the need to defend themselves. Honesty had quietly replaced fear. And somehow, that felt like the strongest foundation either of them had ever known. Winter settled over Chicago once again, bringing quiet Saturday mornings and children bundled in oversized coats as they hurried into the open room. The program had grown far beyond Brielle's expectations. What began with 12 children now welcomed more than 40 every weekend. Additional volunteers had joined. Local businesses donated supplies. Retired teachers offered reading sessions. College students mentored younger children. The room had become exactly what Brielle had dreamed it could be. One Saturday afternoon, after the final child had gone home, Brielle found herself standing near the classroom window watching snow fall outside. Callum quietly carried a box of donated books onto a nearby shelf. Years earlier, he would have filled the silence. Today, he simply worked. After several minutes, Brielle spoke first. "You've changed." He smiled gently. "I've heard that before. I don't mean your clothes." "I know." She turned toward him. "You listen now." He looked puzzled. "I always listened." She shook her head. "No. You waited for people to stop talking." His smile faded. "There is a difference." She walked toward one of the children's paintings hanging on the wall. "When we first met, you always wanted to solve every problem. You believed helping meant finding the answer." She looked back at him. "Now, you ask questions first." Callum reflected on her words before answering. "I realized something." "What?" What? People aren't asking to be rescued as often as they're asking to be understood." Brielle smiled. "Exactly." He laughed quietly. "I learned that here." "No." She shook her head again. "You learned it because you finally became willing to hear things that made you uncomfortable." He nodded slowly. "You're right." Neither of them noticed Mrs. Brooks, watching from the hallway with a quiet smile before she continued walking. She had witnessed hundreds of conversations inside the community center over the years. Very few sounded like this. There was no performance, no attempt to erase the past, only two people speaking honestly after learning how expensive dishonesty could become. Brielle realized she trusted something again. Not promises, not perfect words. She trusted the consistency she had quietly watched every Saturday for months. Trust, she now understood, wasn't rebuilt through one apology. It was rebuilt through ordinary days when no one was keeping score, and Callum had shown up for every one of them. The final child waved goodbye before disappearing into the snowy afternoon with his parents. The community center slowly grew quiet again. Mrs. Brooks switched off the lights in the hallway before calling out, "Don't stay too late." "We won't," Brielle answered with a smile. A few minutes later, only she and Callum remained inside the open room. Children's artwork covered every wall. Fresh paintbrushes soaked in a bucket near the sink. The room felt peaceful. Callum carefully folded one of the tables before turning toward Brielle. "I've been wanting to tell you something." She looked up from the stack of sketchbooks she was arranging. "What is it?" He smiled gently. "I still love you." The words settled quietly between them. There was no dramatic pause, no expectation, no pressure, only honesty. Brielle closed the final sketchbook before walking toward him. When she stopped, only a few feet separated them. "I know." He looked surprised. "You do?" "I've known for a while." She smiled softly. "I still love you too." Neither of them moved. The admission didn't erase the past. It didn't repair every wound. It simply acknowledged something both of them had quietly carried for months. Callum lowered his eyes. "I don't expect that to change anything." "It doesn't," she answered with kindness instead of hesitation. "Not today." He nodded. "I understand." Brielle reached for one of the children's drawings hanging beside the doorway. A little girl had written beneath her picture, "Strong things grow slowly." She smiled as she read the sentence aloud. "I think she's wiser than both of us." Callum laughed. "I think you're right." She looked back at him. "I love who you're becoming. But trust isn't built because someone says the right words. It grows through time. It grows through consistency. And it grows when both people choose it every day." Callum nodded without disappointment. I'll never ask you to rush. You won't have to. She stepped a little closer before gently taking his hand for the first time in many months. Not as a promise, not as a reunion, simply as recognition of the journey they had both taken. For a quiet moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, snow continued falling across Chicago. Inside, two hearts that had once been separated by pride, fear, and painful choices finally stood in the same place again. They still had a future to build. This time, neither of them would build it with promises alone. They would build it one ordinary Saturday at a time. Callum rebuilt his life quietly. He no longer worked under the Rourke family name, no longer sat in boardrooms where power mattered more than people, and no longer allowed anyone to define his future for him. He opened a small grant office near the community center, led by educators, counselors, and local parents. His name wasn't on the door. That mattered to Brielle. Every project passed through people who understood the community, not people seeking applause. He still volunteered every Saturday. He still cleaned tables. He still listened before speaking. Slowly, Brielle saw that he wasn't trying to return to the man he had been. He was becoming someone better. One evening, Callum arrived at the open room after the children had gone home. Brielle noticed he looked nervous, not polished, not rehearsed, simply honest. He stood beside the wall where her painting, still standing, now hung. I bought something months ago, he said. Brielle turned toward him. What? He opened his palm. Inside rested a small ring with a blue stone. No giant diamond, no family jewel, no display of wealth. I chose blue because you once said blue felt like peace. Brielle's throat tightened. Callum quickly added, I'm not asking tonight. She looked at the ring, then back at him. Good. He smiled softly. Good? Yes, let it wait. And for once, waiting felt like love. Months passed before Callum asked again. By then, Brielle had seen enough. Not perfection. Growth. He had kept showing up when nobody praised him. He had respected every boundary. He had answered every hard question without hiding behind shame. One Saturday evening, after the final child left, Callum stood in the middle of the open room with paint on his sleeve and fear in his eyes. Brielle Marin, he said softly, I won't promise a perfect life. She stood still. I promise honesty before comfort. He opened the small ring box. I promise to love you in a way that leaves you free. Tears filled her eyes. This proposal didn't feel grand. It felt true. Yes, she whispered. Then she smiled. But, slowly. Callum laughed through tears. Slowly is still yes. Their wedding took place inside the community center courtyard. No reporters, no society guests, no family politics. Only folding chairs, student artwork, paper flowers, grocery store cake, and people who had watched both of them grow. Noemi cried before Brielle even reached the aisle. Mrs. Brooks wiped her eyes while pretending to adjust programs. August sat quietly in the front row, older and humbled, but grateful. Brielle walked herself down the aisle. When she reached Callum, he took her hand gently. You chose yourself first, he whispered. Thank you for letting me meet you there. Their vows were simple. Truth, respect, patience, partnership. No promises made for strangers. No love built for applause. When they kissed, the children cheered so loudly that everyone laughed. For the first time, love felt light. At the reception, Brielle stood before everyone and spoke from the heart. I once thought love meant holding on harder when something hurt. She looked at the students, then at the adults. Now I know love should never require you to abandon yourself. The courtyard grew quiet. The right love respects your voice. The right love tells the truth before silence becomes a wound. The right love doesn't punish you for having standards. She turned toward Callum. Some stories end when trust breaks. Some begin again only when accountability does the work apology started. Callum held her hand. Brielle smiled. And if life ever forces you to choose between being loved and being respected, choose respect first. Because real love will never ask you to lose yourself to keep it.
Thank you for listening, and thank you for choosing stories that ask more of you. The next story will be waiting.